Great. Okay, thanks everyone for joining. This is the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee meeting for October. We have a hybrid meeting today, some virtually and some in the room here. Our big focus today is to really dig into the task group work and hear from each of the task groups leads and other members, and to really just share where we're at with things and talk about some of the pain points and the items that we really need to be thinking about all together as a subcommittee. So that's the main goal of the meeting. We will also just spend a couple of minutes getting grounded again, because I think that's important because there's so much going on with this work. Sophie is here to help us get a little more plugged into and understand what's going on with the stakeholder engagement. So we'll do that. Again, the big part of the meeting being the task group report out, and we're going to be fortunate to have David Plum from CBI joining us, and he's going to help facilitate that discussion and report out. So that's going to be great. He can't be here until 2, and he'll be joining virtually. But so I'm proposing that we switch the agenda around just a little bit to include the review of the Just Transitions rubric to before that report out. So hopefully that works for everyone. And then at the end, we'll just have some time to recap and talk about the next steps, kind of circling back to the getting grounded part so that we know where we're heading from here. Any questions on the agenda or anything that needs to be added? All right, that's good. Hi, Chris. Let's see. So we need to do the approval of the September 27th meeting. Do we need a few minutes to look through that? Why don't we take a few minutes to do that? I can probably provide the link.
While someone does that, can somebody online talk? I just want to make sure we have the right speaker.
Testing.
Hello.
On my computer, which is odd. So hold on. Something.
Did you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
She's the only one that can. No, it's very quiet.
Yes, we can hear you.
Do we have the volume up on that?
It's
So I just put the link to the minutes in the chat. So if folks want to just click on that and take a few minutes to look through the minutes from our last meeting, that would be great. Okay. So does anybody have any comments or needed corrections on the minutes from last meeting? I don't see anybody. Oh, no, that's us talking. Okay. All right, so I guess we'll consider those approved unless anyone objects. Okay, we're all set with those then. On. I'm gonna attempt to share my screen, see if I have the right thing open here. Okay. So I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to ground us again. I sent an email a week or two ago just to kind of lay out what I see as the remaining work and sort of how it will fit in. I'm sure there's more details than is included here, but again, we're here at this today for this 3-hour meeting. So appreciate you all carving out as much time as you could today. And for those who were able to make it in, that's great to be in person. Again, the work really is to hear from the task groups on the direction that they're heading and talk about sort of the items that we need other task groups in the subcommittee as a whole to weigh in on and to figure out more about what's going on with the stakeholder meetings and how we will prepare and participate in those. In November, oh yeah, and the just transitions rubric is important too. I don't think we'll get into the prioritization framework today, but I just want us to kind of keep that in the back of our minds as we're developing modifications to the strategies and actions. And then November is really busy. We have the stakeholder meetings and I've listed those out there. And Sophie, again, will get into more about that. Then we will, I'm hoping by our November meetings that we will have pretty defined modifications. Today, I'm not expecting that we have revised language to share with everybody or that we go through every action by any means. It's really just to provide direction or an understanding of the direction each task group is going. But by November, I think we have a meeting on the 22nd of November. I really feel like we need to be at a point where we're sharing like pretty solid draft language for the modifications that we want to put forward. We'll be sharing those with the Climate Council in December. And we just need to be making sure that we have, we can share that with each other, what our modifications are, and then look to apply the rubric and the prioritization framework from that point to the end of the year when we really need to consider our recommendations final. And so that's, getting into the December, the final edits and prioritization. So that's what I see as the work and the time frame to do it. Again, with the stakeholder meetings in November and the need to continue to meet as task groups, I just don't think it's feasible to have another meeting until the subcommittee meeting until the end of November. So that's the schedule. Does anybody have any questions or comments or anything to add to that?
Another question, Andrea, or maybe for Liz. So when you say kind of having completed actions, does that include sort of a narrative around the actions as well, like a full written out section template, or is that really just like an action spreadsheet? Do you know?
My hope is that it's just the spreadsheet. I think the narrative part and the writing comes after, in the beginning of the year, maybe before we. Yeah, Liz, that would actually be great because in this agenda item, I have sort of the grounding and the Vermont Climate Council update. So if you can help frame sort of the rest of the work beyond December, my hope, Marion, is that it's just the spreadsheet with, sort of finalized language for the pathway strategies and actions, and that the narrative part comes later. But Liz, maybe you can help.
Yeah, so by the December 16th council meeting is when everything in the templates will be moved to the council. I don't have details on what happens after that, but we're working on that internally and we'll be getting that information out to folks soon. But it's everything that's in the templates, so action strategies and whatnot.
Okay, and the way I understand it from what I heard at the steering committee meeting earlier this week was that they'll be drafting between the end of the year and somewhere, I think in the March, April timeframe is when the Climate Council, probably with great support from the Climate Action Office, is planning to go out and seek input on the climate action plan and then have the final edits, have, April, May, June to do the final edits and hopefully have a plan by July 1st. Anything to add on that, Liz or Sophie or?
That's right. There's going to be work on like prioritization and the drafting after things get moved over to the council level.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think, we'll do our part in the prioritization coming from the subcommittees and there'll be a larger effort to figure out what on the overall top priorities of the plan, I'm sure. So, okay, any other questions? Yes.
Hey, so I know we need to be as complete and comprehensive as possible, but we also are going to have the opportunity to incorporate feedback from the public too, right? So hopefully we'll learn from that and other input. So,
Yeah.
so while we should be as complete as possible, if there are other things that are missing, we can always add them later, because chances are whatever we would add would come out of the public or other stakeholders anyway.
Yeah, November is a big month because we're sort of thinking about a direction and hopefully that direction will mostly stick, but yeah. Tons of stakeholder and the cross-cutting meetings going on and the RPC meetings, so we'll have something similar, but condensed compared to what we're going to hear today, but that's what we'll go and talk to our stakeholders about. So we will get more detail on the actual dates for that and then use that input to finalize what we present to each other on the 22nd. So I keep saying the next month is going to be really busy. The next month is going to be really busy. There's a lot of work to do. So again, just like super appreciation for everybody. It's a lot of work and we all have other things in our lives and in our careers that are taking away from that, competing with that. So definitely appreciate all the energy and effort that everyone's putting into this. I can probably stop sharing this. Okay. So I guess we'll move on, Sophie, to the stakeholder engagement update and what we need to get together to make that as fruitful conversation as it was yesterday at the buildings in Thermal. I don't know if others had a chance to listen in on that, but if you didn't, definitely suggest spinning through that at whatever speed is comfortable for you of the recording, because it was really a great meeting. Super job on getting the right people to attend and the input was amazing. So I'm hoping that ours are going to be just as valuable.
That's a great point. That's helpful. And that also might having had one of those sessions already, you get the benefit of like kind of seeing like, oh, that's what one of them could look like. Obviously very different content for you all. So forgive me, please let me know if I leave any gaping holes because this is my third time coming to a subcommittee. So I think I'm starting from scratch with you all and I'm going to try and make sure I get to everything, but let me know if anything I say doesn't make sense. So I think I'm going to share my screen to share with you all the template that we've developed.
Well, I
go
will,
ahead, yeah.
Bronwyn and I have been working on the template, so I think that's what we were gonna share kind of
Okay.
after you present.
Okay, so
So
maybe
happy to walk through that at least with folks.
Great, then I won't, yes, sounds great. So I guess here are a couple things that I can share with you all. One is that, we're starting to get invitations rolling out. Those are based on what we heard from you all of who should be invited. So we have a preliminary list both for the businesses audience and for the municipal support organization audience. There, especially in the municipal support organization audience, there's a couple overlaps with people or entities that the Agriculture and Ecosystems Subcommittee wanted to invite in there. So I've got that, so they'll get like both invitations at once. So there is some overlap, but you don't have to worry too much about that because we're making sure that it comes across smoothly on their end. One thing that I wondered about doing is sharing with you all kind of like where the invitation list stands once we've gotten some of those out and letting you know, hey, if you think of somebody else who isn't on this list that now occurs to you, feel free to invite them. If that sounds good to you, I could do that.
Yeah. I mean, even starting right from the beginning, we've got one on the 8th
Yes.
and one on the 15th, and in the two different groups that we're talking about, just to remind everybody.
Sure thing. So we've got I think they're both Fridays. November 8th, we've got the one focused on the businesses audience. And what I recall from and how we've been framing it based on your last conversation is you kind of wanted to cover the breadth of topics that the task groups are covering in both sessions. So similar content of here's what we're thinking about, but the discussion is going to be geared differently because of the audiences that you're attracting to each one. So that one on the 8th is focused towards businesses and business support organizations. For example, we've got like the Vermont Community Loan Fund on there, the Vermont Bond Bank, Small Business Association, Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility, Vermont Professionals of Color, whole list of business support organizations. So that's your audience on the 8th. Then on the 15th, similar content, but geared towards town support organizations. For example, Vermont Council on Rural Development, Watersheds United Vermont is one that comes to mind that was on that Ag Eco overlap, for example. And I'll just note on that town support organizations one, there are separately going to be sessions for like town officials and town staff. And that's helped out by, we're working with RPCs to host those sessions. So that's kind of the distinction between these is that the rural resilience one on the 15th, only covering your topics and geared towards town support organizations. You might get a couple of municipal officials there. The town support organizations are your audience. And then the municipal input sessions, which are going to be on November 19th, supported by RPCs, are attracting town staff and elected officials, maybe some volunteers. And that's going to include content from all 3 drafting subcommittees. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of the distinction. I saw you had a
For the November 15th, RPC is going to be right.
I believe they're on our list.
It's the 15th.
I'm gonna have to double check my.
I mean, I've sent it to all directors. I've sent these to all directors.
You down and sending it to directors.
And,
Because you
and,
mentioned, I'm hoping they are.
I think so.
and that's the one, and that's the 19th, yeah, so, and I've encouraged the other directors to invite staff. Sometimes,
Well, that's the
sometimes,
15th.
right.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, I've not, but I've sent them to, because we overlap on all of these.
Yeah.
So I've encouraged the directors to share with, and like a number of my staff are participating in multiple.
I'll make sure they're on there if they're not, but I'm pretty sure.
And if they're already going around, like on the building for thermal group yesterday, there were some staff from RPCs on that conversation. So I think they're already, as Chris said, you shared it around and folks are.
And I should share it with the Building Energy Code Working Group.
Yeah.
Can I, just while I'm yakking,
Yeah.
have the long-term recovery groups been like intentionally invited to talk, to engage in one of these?
That would be great. I don't think I have them on my list. Where would we, we can
Jason-
connect later, but if you know where to get those.
Jason Goslin has a list for that whole long-term recovery group. Not just the LTRGs, but also the other agencies and other staff people who are just other partners that are engaging in this conversation.
I think that would be really important.
Yeah, leave it out would be really.
And that's exactly what, like, that this conversation and that email can bring to light is like, did we miss anybody really important? Let's figure that out.
Yeah.
So
Do we have
Caroline,
an idea of the volume of attendees for each of these or no?
I can tell you, if you had asked me 2 days ago, I would have said no. But we just had the first one yesterday and we had 59 participants. I think it will be more going forward because we're just gonna have more time of having gotten the word out. And we're working on a press release that I don't know if it'll get any traction, but, so if I were to guess, I would say maybe anticipate 85. But I don't know, it's really hard to say with these more, specific audiences.
Yeah.
Caroline's asking who should be at the one on the 19th, which is the municipal, the
Yeah,
RPC municipal one.
I think the goal is that there's a representative from each subcommittee at
Each meeting.
one of the ones on the 19th.
Is the 19th the one where there's one during the day and then one later?
Exactly, exactly. There's two and they're the same content. They're just at 2 different times so that we can
Yeah,
make sure to capture.
that is one thing I wanted to make sure we covered today, because I don't think we
Yes.
have people named to that yet.
That would be great.
Um,
Thank you for thinking of that.
Houses.
Alice, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, how did you advertise the event yesterday or the day before?
We emailed.
I know I got everything. I got a long email with all the dates and subjects on it. But I was
There's a
wondering
very
how,
Specific invite list, because we've been asking, Sophie's been asking, and people have been providing names of organizations. We talked about that at our last meeting, and I think David and Ann met and provided some organizations' names, and Sophie's been getting contacts and reaching out to those people, but I think we just want to make sure that we share it with our audiences as well. So I think a big part of it is spreading the word, like Chris has spread it to the RPCs, and yeah, I think it's
okay,
on all of us to reach out to folks that we think would benefit from those two distinct groups.
okay, so the target is more organizations. Is it
Yes.
individuals that would want to know?
The target audience for the 8th is business support organizations and businesses. And then the target audience for the 15th is town support organizations. That was my understanding from the conversation last time.
That's what yep. And I don't know, if we can throw the SharePoint
Is-
link. Liz, could you throw the SharePoint link in the chat maybe of the lists? So folks can look at that and see if anything else comes to mind, like Chris just pointed out.
Because I wasn't sure.
We got it.
We had an article in Waitsfield in the Valley Reporter, and it featured me and Dr. Levine and talked a lot about the work that the Public Health Task Force was doing, but also mentioned that what people liked was that there is representation on the Climate Council subcommittee from Waitsfield, from the Valley, like we've got somebody. And I'm not sure how this article came about because neither of us were interviewed for it. I'm betting it was an AI generated story, but it got feedback and people were saying, okay, how can we find out more about this? So I posted the other day's presentation on Front Porch Forum. Just because people want information. Like there's individuals who have now contacted me saying, how do we find out more about it? And I can answer some questions, but I don't want to be flooded with them, if you know what I mean. So do we advertise this for you on places like Front Porch Forum or not?
You are most welcome to. And
Okay.
I also understand that people's capacity is constrained. So also just want to say, like, if you don't have the time for it, it's okay.
Mhm.
But Alice, I actually have a friend who came to that session because you posted it on Front Porch Forum. And
Hey, good.
about inviting individuals, like these are all open to the public. Any member
That's
of the
right.
public is welcome, and that's great to have people observing, and that's a form of participation and education as well. So if we've got an audience of individuals who aren't necessarily experts or professionally involved, that's important, and Front Porch Forum is like, for example, a helpful way for that to happen.
Okay, and then I'd like to mention the one where the RPC, it's, will be there or focused on RPCs in towns, because I'm working on the regional plan for the Central Vermont Planning Commission. And we are specifically working on how we thread climate change and mitigation activities throughout the entire regional plan. So I just thought I'd toss that out there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can do this or make if you feel better about the office doing it. Wouldn't be a bad idea to invite the County Regional Government Study Committee and the Technical Advisory Group for the meetings on, could be any of them, but especially rural resilience and town support and municipal climate action. Because a lot of what they're looking at is capacity, like at what levels of government do you have capacity, or could we have capacity to do work more effectively?
Great. Chris, I'm taking notes on these suggestions, and I'll follow up with you, and we can make a plan.
Thank you.
I have a question. Sorry.
Sorry, I was just following up. Since it's a formal thing, that may be better done by the office or something as opposed to me as a member.
Yeah.
But you're all call, whatever.
No,
Yeah, we'll
That's
make a
great.
plan for sure.
Go ahead, Dahlia.
Okay, sorry. I looked at the RSVP for both of the stakeholder meetings, and it looked like it was around an hour and a half.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious what work we're doing to ensure that we can hear from everybody that we want to hear from in that time period, or is that kind of in the hands of David Plum?
Yeah, it was an hour and a half yesterday, and there was so many comments and so many people willing to speak up, which was great. So I think that's something that we can talk about with our presentation to make sure we don't drag that out too long and provide just the right level of detail to get people thinking about this, or understanding. They're already thinking about it, but understanding where we're at with our efforts and the direction that we're going, and then they can, react to that too. But I think it's important to kind of reserve an hour for the discussion.
Yeah, at the event yesterday, Dahlia, I think the task group presented for about 20 minutes, and then the remainder was all facilitated discussion led by David. And it was a series of just asking folks for their feedback on what had been shared, and then some Menti poll survey questions. So there were kind of a handful of different ways folks were providing feedback, but I recall seeing they ended the presentation after about 20-25 minutes and spent the rest of the time getting feedback from folks.
But I have the same concern, I think, is that if there were 59, they actually said 70 during the meeting, but it's 59 people. Let's say 18 to 20, I think, probably spoke. There was a significant chat volume, which has been shared by David Plum. But I think also maybe some limitations. There are a couple people who apologized but spoke for longer than they could have, as opposed to putting it in the chat. So I think it's beneficial to think about how to expand the content. 20-25 minutes, you can't really do a presentation less than that and really get everything out. But I also have questions about how we're going to present. I don't know if you want to talk about that now or.
Yeah, I think, well, you're gonna go over a little bit about what you have. And I know there was also some questions that the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee came up with to be pointed about what we want to hear about, and then of course listen, but
interestingly enough, they didn't use the question.
yeah.
I think there was at least one that came up with Melissa came on and asked about funding. And So another thing that I'll flag for you all, I think the questions are helpful also in the development of what you want to hear. It's a helpful exercise internally. And we were able to share out the slides and the questions in advance with everybody who had signed up until 5 p.m. the day before. We didn't, like, if somebody signed up day of, we didn't get them out to them. But so there were probably like 2/3 of the people who signed up got those questions by email in advance. I don't know how many read that. To follow up on the point of people speaking wrong, I think there is a little more we could do to like introduce at the beginning of like, especially if we have more people on the call, to help make sure everybody gets a chance to speak. Another thing we can do, like you noted the chat, some people might be somebody who needs to hear things and process and then have a comment. So letting people know, we did this in the chat, like you can email us or call us or fill out the public comment form afterwards. You know, it's not a one and done thing. And we did get some comments by email that way. So just noting that some people might not feel comfortable speaking up in a public meeting or might leave a little time, so we can make sure to make all of those options for weighing in obvious.
And some people are there just to listen too. They're not necessarily looking to provide.
I mean, I thought it was highly successful.
Yeah.
But I think one other thing to think about is whether or not you want to make sure that people from different, I want to call them sectors, but they're not really sectors, different organizational structures are represented at the meeting, you know, through the chat or through comments. So if you have towns, cities, villages, RPCs, other support organizations, trying to make sure, I don't know who would be responsible for that there's a mix of comments from different groups.
Yeah.
So somebody's not excluded from that.
Yeah, maybe, I know at the beginning we did, one of the Menti polls was like, what's your connection to this? Why are you here? So we could kind of adapt that and we could, you know.
We can, questions about that, sorry, I didn't interrupt that.
Yeah, I was thinking we could flag that for the facilitator, like, oh, have we only been hearing from RPCs?
Yeah.
Let's explicitly say like, hey, if you are from such and such, we really want to make sure you hear from you.
You know, can we hear some more from small towns or
Yeah.
whatever?
Yeah.
Great, this is all really super helpful. I wonder if before we move on to the presentation, we want to find 2 brave volunteers. You don't have to do anything too brave, just for the attendance on the 19th session, 1 person for the midday and 1 person for the evening. Scott, amazing. Do you have a preference between, I think the midday is like 11 or 11:30 and then the evening is 6 p.m.
And I can,
Okay, so we've got Scott and Chris.
what are we doing?
The RPC.
Love the enthusiasm.
No, but I mean,
We're just a town.
Just attending and
of course, yeah, not plan to be up to many other, but yeah, sure. If I need to do interpretive dance or.
I mean, I won't stop by to.
Yeah. Did you say noon and 6?
19th is a Tuesday.
Yeah.
That sounds right to me.
I can do midweek, say 11 o'clock. I'll do midday 11.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you both.
I can also represent Essex.
Unless there's any other questions, I feel we can pass off to the presentation.
All right, pull it up here. So as Sophie started to say, Sophie and Liz amazingly have put together a template for all of the subcommittees to use for the events. And Andrea asked Bronwyn and I if we could, I'm sorry, that's not what I want. This one. If we could start drafting what it might look like for the for our events. I think there's a number of places where I have questions and I'm going to look for help from folks. So do not take this at all as final, but I think helpful to walk through the template to kind of show what Sophie and Liz had put together for us to be able to use, and then figure out where we want to ask sort of specific targeted questions and how to structure it in a way to what Dolly and others noted, to ensure we can hear from folks. So hopefully people can see my screen. Let's see, it starts out with sort of just an overview about the climate action plan, the intended update cycle, and what this a particular update for 2025 focuses on. I think as I go through this, Sophie, who does this part? Is that something we as a subcommittee have to figure out, or is that something David or someone else does? I think these are not questions we've answered yet in this group, is like who's actually managing the presentation.
I was just trying to remember from last time, and I'm blanking. I think somebody from the subcommittee did this. I think it was David Farnsworth.
Okay.
Maybe just kicked it off.
Okay, so I'll walk through the whole template, but I think that's a key question is for both. This is the template for the business support organizations, because that's the first one. I have, again, the template for the municipal support organizations. For the 15th looks quite similar, but we're, as a subcommittee, going to have to really lead the presentation. I think David Plum, who's with Consensus Building Institute, will help facilitate the conversation after we do the presentation, but I think folks just make a note and we'll come back to it about if you're willing to present some portion of this presentation, because it's really intended to be an input session for us as the subcommittee to use to gather input on our recommended actions. So TBD on who's doing this, but a few intro slides on what the CAP is, the update cycle itself, which I think is helpful to ground folks in. So it talks about, where the work was starting back in the spring to update the CAP, kind of the work that's happening right now to draft pathway strategies and actions, noting we're right here, gathering input through these input sessions. And as we talked about at the beginning of the meeting, we as the subcommittee will sort of pass over recommendations to the Climate Council. I think it's helpful, and Bronwyn and I chatted about this earlier this week, to note in this presentation, and I have a note on it later on, that the subcommittees are really advisory to the Climate Council, and it's the Climate Council that ultimately finalizes and adopts the climate action plan. And so to note for folks that this is sort of the first pass to get that input, but then the recommendations will be handed over to the council for further discussion and feedback. And then again, the finalization of it happening in July. So grounding folks in the time frame. I was thinking as we walk through this and talk a little bit about the charge of the subcommittee to ground folks in the Global Warming Solutions Act definitions for resilience and adaptation. So we're all, both for the municipal support organizations and the business organizations, we're kind of grounded in how the GWSA talks about resilience. And then have a slide noting that the subcommittee's charge is to really focus on the impacts of climate change on various municipal infrastructure and support services, and then to focus specifically on the pressures that adapting to climate change poses to Vermont communities. So this comes directly from the Global Warming Solutions Act. And then the other component of the slide would be to sort of highlight the 3 focus areas for our subcommittee, which are the 3 task groups. I think one of the kind of comments to make, we've been talking a lot about the buildings and thermal task group, or the buildings and thermal input session yesterday. What was, I think, nice for them was that was really focused on the work of one task group itself. I think as we talk about business support organizations and sort of organizations that support municipalities, there will likely be questions and recommendations that cut across the work of all 3 of our task groups, which is great. I think will be helpful for all of us on the subcommittee to get input through these sessions. The flip side is there's a potential to have a really long list of things to have to talk through. So I think we're going to have to be really targeted about what we want to share and how we share that to get the feedback we're looking
Can I ask
for.
a quick question?
Yeah.
So in the first description there, I've forgotten, is that in statute, or is that something the council already agreed on, or?
No, it's in statute. Yeah. Mhm.
The thing that just strikes me that's missing there, we don't have to fix it, I'll just mention it.
Yeah.
Is households,
It's
because we keep aggregating everything up, but we don't seem to acknowledge the traumas that are happening at the actual household.
Well, I think that's something we should talk about, and I'm totally open. The council, when the council first formed, kind of expanded the charges for the subcommittees. We could go back and look at that. I'm not entirely sure if even that expansion covered households. So I was sort of limiting this to just what's in the GWSA, but there is a point later on where we're sort of looking at like what type of feedback we want, where we can say we as a subcommittee for this update to the CAP are interested in sort of expanding what we looked at for the last one. So that's sort of the first 4 slides there are grounding us in the process to update the cap and sort of the broad focus of the subcommittee, and then narrowing in on the charges and really the work of the 3 task groups. And then the next slide from the template was really to say, and today we're interested really in focusing on business resilience. We could also adjust this to say focused on business support organizations that enhance resilience. So I'm open to different wording here, but trying to narrow in on what we're trying to focus on. And then the guidance in the template, Sophie, that you shared kind of noted that we could speak to where the Global Warming Solutions Act talks about businesses, which to be honest, it doesn't really. So I noted here where there were kind of key actions from the 2021 Climate Action Plan that focus on businesses, but there aren't many. So this is a great opportunity for us to say we're interested in expanding as a subcommittee, and really pulling in voices and stakeholders that we didn't really hear from or maybe missed in the last cap.
Did we really want to say flooding?
The one around climate, I kind of summarized the actions here because they were a little long. So the climate change impact assessment might talk about flooding.
The second was developing.
Oh, no, that did not talk about flooding. Well, and so the reason the background for this is this was an action that there is some language in the Global Warming Solutions Act that talks about impact to particular sectors for drought, irregular snowfall, and sugaring, and it doesn't talk about flooding. So that's for the last cap, that's what we included in the language for this, because we wanted to ensure we were kind of meeting that statutory requirement, but yes, real gap
For
there.
folk who don't know, I was previously on the council and involved in drafting the first plan.
What an eye-opening comment, yeah. So grounding us rounding out slide 6 is really where we were at in terms of the 2021 cap. And I think I have some notes here, but whoever's doing this slide can kind of talk a little bit about our interest in expanding. Chris, maybe you want to do this one and expanding our focus for this one. I will say I took noting the buildings and thermal session yesterday had a lot of slides that they had from the Energy Action Network recent progress report and kind of expanded the use of the template. And so I am borrowing some slides from a recent UPenn design studio that was up in Vermont looking at resilience in particular communities. So I thought I would include a few of the slides here, kind of grounding us in, both climate change is causing our average annual temperatures to increase. When we talk about businesses, that has a number of influences both to our workforce and to the types of businesses and kind of the natural resource sectors and others that, rely on, particular Vermont climate to provide services. And then also increase average annual precipitation amounts. And then this was a really great graphic that, again, I'm borrowing from the UPenn studio where they sort of show a cross section of Montpelier. And you can see the 2025 flood line here and sort of just noting that in Vermont, a lot of our downtown areas and therefore economic centers are located in the floodplain. It can have this, that flooding can have a intense impact on kind of our economic centers, our business resilience, and the ability for our communities to thrive in the face of climate impact. So we don't have to include this. I'm just trying to think about kind of how we ground the conversation about businesses.
It's a good idea. The only thing that concerns me is largely inundation flooding.
Yes.
And so we need to be thinking actually for a lot of our villages that are on alluvial fans, them actually not being there anymore.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, good.
And on the water, the precipitation one.
Yeah.
We should note because other people will, doesn't include 21, 22, 23.
Yeah, we're kind of ending.
And the other
Additional
point
ones.
to this, I think that is just worth footnoting is that we're just getting started, right? The climate's we're going to continue to warm, the atmosphere is going to be continuing to hold more water. So this is we're at the beginning of the story, not
Right.
it's going to get a lot worse.
Right. Yeah, so these are all optional slides, and I think we can make adjustments to them, and I'll share this. I think I have some thoughts, but again, as I'm walking through this, think about which sections you might be interested in presenting, and then where you think we might need adjustments or changes to these slides. Again, this is just using the template that the Climate Office team provided, but it's up to us to manipulate and use as we see fit. The other interesting piece, again, from this UPenn planning studio is they did this map of Barrie overlaying flood hazard areas with number of workers and job centers. And so you see a lot, at least in downtown Barrie, a lot of overlap between prime job centers, economic impact, and flooding. Again, I think in including, that for I'm using these graphics from UPenn Studio. They're focused on flooding only. I think worth highlighting for folks that we're not just focused on flooding here. There are other climate impacts, and thinking specifically about the impacts to outdoor workers, in particular business sectors with drought. There are other things that sort of the climate action plan needs to address, but flooding is often front of mind for folks, and I thought these graphics were helpful to ground us in some of the conversation. So optional to include these, we don't have to, but just thought I would share some of the ideas of what we could use to start the conversation. And then I'll just say the last handful of slides here. So this again from the template, to highlight kind of the existing pathways as they existed from the 2021 climate action plan. I really like Sophie's idea of sharing the slides in advance, and Bronwyn and I had also chatted about sharing, which the link is on the website. It's like a couple page PDF table of the pathway strategies and actions from the last CAP for rural resilience, sharing that in advance so folks can review what was existing and what we're updating for the plan. I think this is where really the question comes in about where we want to focus our discussion with these particular interested party focus groups. If we're to include, this is just one page with the pathways, if we're to include every strategy and every action, that's going to be a lot of slides and way too much to talk through.
Yeah.
So I think the question here is, and I'm actually interested, Sophie, in the template that's provided, there's no real slide to show actions. It's just the pathways and strategies. But I think if we don't show the actions, it's hard to really get into a detailed conversation. So one sec, Scott, I'll get to you in a moment. So I think I think it's helpful because as we think about sort of business support, I think it cuts across the 3 task groups that we're all working on. I think helpful to show the 5 pathways here, but I think we'll want to be targeted in what we actually highlight for strategies and actions, and whether or not we include language we have already edited or existing language from the 2021 CAP, and just highlight for folks that we are in the process of editing and want their feedback broadly. Scott, go ahead.
The Thermal group had a really good slide, I thought, which is an intro to this one. Prior to this, have a definition of pathway, strategy, and action.
Yeah, it's always something like that.
Because otherwise, if you just talk about the pathways, I think actions are more.
Yeah.
Because most of the recommendations are actions.
Yeah. Okay, that's one we can definitely add, and I can borrow it from the thermal task group. Slide, just making notes. The other thing I'm curious when we get to the conversation that maybe Liz is leading about the cross-cutting pathways is how to highlight that here. I think particularly the cross-cutting pathway around workforce would be of great interest to the business community, but also the focus on compact settlement, which is the other cross-cutting pathway. So I'm not sure where those are at, but whether we want to include those on a slide like this or a second slide would be great to hear. So let me just round out kind of my walkthrough of this template, and then we'd love to hear folks' thoughts. So again, the template has, we could highlight the pathways and the strategies underneath. We could do something like what Buildings and Thermal did yesterday, where I think they had strategy and even kind of revised actions, but it was pretty targeted in what they included. So would love to hear people's thoughts on this. And then the last is sort of our group discussion, and this is what David Plum will facilitate. These are Bronwyn and my messy notes from our conversation earlier this week, but I think we had talked about, potentially where we have it showing the revised language that we have developed for strategies. I know in our community capacity and planning task group, we have some revised language already, so it might be helpful to show that. Could ask some broad questions just about where the business community sees themselves in advancing climate work. Where would they like to see amendments, changes, or additions to the existing pathways and strategies as we show them? Reminder that our job is advisory to the Climate Council, and is there anything that the business community wants to sort of reflect back to the Climate Council more broadly? And then would love to hear folks' thoughts. I think in your task groups, if you've been talking about particular actions that have a real nexus with businesses, those might be ones we want to highlight. And then if there's any particular questions we want to ask. As folks have said in the Buildings and Thermal meeting yesterday, they didn't get to too many questions, but there was an opportunity to at least ask some of them to target the conversation. And that's it. So still some work needed in the slide deck, but would love to have people's thoughts, and also can start jotting down names of people who are particularly interested in doing sections of this presentation for 2 weeks from now. And then we'll just say I have a very similar template for the municipal support organizations, and same question goes around, what do we want to highlight? What kind of discussion questions do we want to show? I think for that one, there's a lot more of a nexus with the community capacity and planning task group. But no, there's overlap too with public health and infrastructure. So
Can I ask a quick question for
Yeah.
context?
Yeah,
Can you go back up to the 12 or 13?
this one.
Yeah.
These
So do you know off the top of your head, like how many? I mean, like, how, is that like
Well, so
5 slides worth of stuff?
Well, so if we do like our 5 pathways, there's probably on average 3 or 4 strategies per pathway, so
And how many actions would you get?
that's
So
gonna be a
many.
lot.
Yeah,
That's
That's what
Yeah.
I figured.
Which is
Okay.
tough, I think, yeah, the buildings at thermal group, but it's hard though, because I think to talk at a pathway level, it's almost hard to react to, they're so broad. So I don't, I don't,
We're gonna get that sense when we go through our task groups and.
yeah, well, and that's why, we can kind of save some of this kind of more focused discussion for like the end of the day today, or I can follow up in an email. I think as we talk through where the task groups are at, it might illuminate where we have key questions to ask folks. But I think particularly for the business one, as Bronwyn and I were putting this together, there's not a whole lot, at least for the community capacity and planning group, where we're actually focused on businesses themselves. And so I was having a hard time thinking of like particular themes we would want to highlight for them. Bronwyn, I know you've been thinking about it a lot, so go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, yeah, I have been thinking about it a lot. Sorry, I'm a disembodied voice right now. I'll turn my camera on. Yeah, I have been thinking about it a little bit, and I mean, I think we can kind of forecast that that is probably going to be one of the pieces of feedback. I think there's some things in here that have to do with community infrastructure that businesses very much rely on and have a say in and want to see be more resilient, so that their businesses in those communities can be more resilient. But I do think it would be fair for us to expect a lot of feedback that says, this is great in terms of the community, but within my own business, we still are looking for additional support or have needs that are not reflected in the climate action plan as it is. And I think that would be fair feedback, and I think we're ready to hear that.
So then is your thought, Bronwyn, as you and I talked about, could share the, again, the actions from the 2021 cap out in advance, and then, walk through the pathways, maybe walk through the strategies, and at least where we have information to share on particular strategies that we're changing the language for or thinking about adapting, but share all of it. Well, I mean, not share all of it in terms of share the pathways and strategies, and then kind of be prepared for that feedback about more detailed questions.
Yeah, and I think to try and go through that fairly quickly, I mean, ideally, we would be giving this stakeholder group the revised pathway strategies and actions in advance so they can have some time to absorb it and think about it. But we don't have that time, unfortunately. So I think the best sort of mid-ground we could come up with is we'll give them the original rural resilience and adaptation document from the climate plan, knowing that if anything, those will be condensed a bit, but it kind of gives the flavor. And then hopefully in the presentation, if we are able to present the updates, they've still had a chance to kind of think about it and mull it around so that they're not showing up to a meeting blind and trying to respond to something on the spot that they haven't had a lot of time to think about. Because I think that's where we're probably not going to get a lot of useful feedback.
Yeah. Any other thoughts from folks? Sections you really want to present?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What was the plan with the questions that weren't able to be discussed that came up at the last meeting and might come up at this event as well?
Oh, you mean like how,
Follow up
for
unanswered questions.
I don't know. I actually had to leave early, so I don't know if folks, what happened yesterday.
Do you mean questions that like audience members have?
Right, that you weren't able to address because of the time constraint.
I wonder if there were any. I'm trying to think if there were any questions they had for us. I will look back at that. That's a really good point. I know one of the things we were talking about before, like the questions that the subcommittee had like listed out in advance of like, here's the way things we want to ask in the discussion. Those weren't like fully explicitly asked. And I noted that in terms of like, what maybe we can incorporate that into David Plump's facilitation. He was talking more about like having it be more of a back and forth, and that could be a way in which to do that. So I don't know if that was also kind of on your mind too, but that would be, I think in terms of, if you guys have your questions of what you want to ask, making sure that those are pretty explicitly part of the discussion, I think is an improvement.
Yeah, I think that's good too. I mean, we're not gonna do a responsive summary or anything, but I think they just have to have some hope and confidence that if they do provide comments beyond what is we're able to discuss during the session, that we're gonna consider them. I mean, I don't think there's much more we can do than that.
I did like, oh, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
So I was just gonna say, and talk about questions, I just wonder if we should kind of preface the invitation to offer, for the commentary that we're not just looking, we're not asking for solutions necessarily. I mean, if you've got solutions, that's awesome, but if you have questions about that, yeah, just that's okay, that's the expectation is we want to hear your concerns and what questions do you have that you're trying to answer yourself or your community answer or whatever. Cause I just worry sometimes when we, not worry, but sometimes we do these things, people feel pressure to kind of come up with the solutions as opposed to kind of acknowledging, I don't know what to do, and these are the things I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah. I do, just thinking about the event yesterday and to some comments about ensuring we can hear everyone, did really like that it was most of the talking was being done by participants, not by members of the subcommittee. And so I think, we should set some ground rules for ourselves around like, this isn't a subcommittee meeting where we want to have sort of long explanations of like how we're getting to particular actions. I think we want to hear from folks, thank them for their input, thank them for their questions, and then allow other people to kind of share the feedback. And I liked yesterday where there weren't folks necessarily offering solutions, but a lot of really targeted, like, hey, have you thought about this? Here's a particular thing we're seeing. We don't know the answer, but like, would like to see this or that. And so,
my work.
yeah, and so I think that, just, and David is great at kind of facilitating that style, but I think just a heads up for us as subcommittee members, like, we're there to listen and kind of get that feedback from folks and want to be able to hear from those people who are there.
We kind of need to wrap this part of our conversation up today, so I want to make sure we get what we need out of it and or talk about what kind of follow-up there will be.
Yeah, so a couple of things. So I think if folks are good with sort of how Bronwyn characterized, like we'll share, I put the link in the chat to the pathway strategies and actions from the 2021 CAP, share that in advance. I think we could include some language to say the subcommittee is currently working on revisions. Some of that might be shared in the presentation itself, but please, if you're able, familiarize yourself with what was in the last CAP, and we'll be asking you for input and feedback on where you might see yourselves or see additions or changes needed. And then can take, if we're okay with that, I think can take the existing strategies, put it in the slideshow here, pathways and strategies. I can send it out to folks, and I think would look to the task group leads to help me if you want to have revised strategy language reflected in the presentation itself. I'll send it out and just send me back that revised language. I can also make some notes to reach out today. If we have those that we want to come through, it sounds like we're not going to show action, so I can go ahead and do that. And then the other key ask is really figuring out who wants to present what. So maybe, I don't know if there's like a run of show document anywhere that we could use as like a template, but we could start to assign and break out who wants to do what.
David sent out
He did.
okay, but let me find that.
So I can follow up and share that with folks, I think, and again, would be great to split it up between a handful of subcommittee members. And we have two meetings. We have the business one, and then we have the municipal support one a week later. So lots of opportunity to get everybody up and talking. And so I can follow up with that next step, but yeah. Okay, can kind of fill out a sign out sheet, or something.
Yeah, I guess as we kind of get more clear on how many slides we're going to have when we're talking about the pathways and strategies, deciding how much of the beginning slides that we provide, and maybe they're not, maybe one or two is on flooding, but try to, I can't remember what the first draft was. I don't know.
One is heat, one is flooding.
Okay. Yeah. So maybe maybe we don't need the graph or the precipitation, maybe we just show, I like the other two slides of the
Mhm.
towns.
Mhm.
So, yeah, just kind of figuring out time wise.
Yep.
Because it could take a little while.
Yeah,
to go
totally.
through.
No, we
Sorry,
want.
one more question. The questions that we're developing for these presentations, how are we going to develop those
Oh, that's a
questions?
good question.
You want input from people?
Yeah, definitely. I was kind of thinking we might get some of that out from our conversation today
I think
over the
so
next
too.
2 hours, so I can. I mean, there's multiple people taking notes, who's taking notes, I can take notes,
Yeah,
and then in a follow-up email about asking people about the slides and who wants to present, can also share a editable document to get thoughts on questions. And we can add that to the end for our discussion portion.
mhm.
Does that make sense?
I think that the use of UPenn illustrative
Mhm.
diagrams is fine, but we really do need to, I just reiterate, we need to really set the context for why you're sharing those. Because I just tell you from the Southern Vermont perspective, it's gonna be, there you go again.
Mhm.
Focusing on, I mean, everybody I think
I know,
recognizes what
I
happened
know.
on Montpelier and Berry, but
Yeah,
they would also say what happened in Weston, what happened in Londonderry.
Oh,
what
I
happened
think the
in
same thought
Wilmington.
too.
Yeah.
So-
Because it kind of reinforces the opinion that we're Northern Rhode Island or something.
Well, I think either we could opt not to include those,
I think it's-
or just really like clarify.
I think it's fine to say that
Um,
this was a very recent, University of Pennsylvania thing.
Yeah.
I think that's totally fine, just for the context of the.
Totally. Well, the other thing we could do, which I've done this in some presentations, is even just like, you take screenshots of, like headlines
Yeah.
from particular
Yeah.
events and say like, and we could include some,
Yeah.
ones from in Southern Vermont. So we could also do that.
And Northeast Kingdom.
And exactly,
Yeah.
like other areas that aren't the focus of the youth and studio, which is Central Vermont. So.
so we are about 20 minutes behind on our agenda and feel like we have a lot. Good thing our professional facilitator has joined us. And we can maybe try to get back on track here. We had talked about moving the agenda items around. We haven't done the just transitions, David, yet. So yeah, we're 20 minutes behind, but let's try to stick to the layout here and get the just transitions later after we hear about the report outs. So, thank you, everyone. David Plum is here from CBI to help us through the big part of our agenda here. Liz, do you want to just spend just a couple of minutes providing just a real update, not necessarily getting into the weeds about what's happening with those cross-cutting subcommittees, or they call some, whatever, task groups?
Happy to. Yeah, we, all the groups, so education, workforce development, compact settlement, had their first meetings this week. And they are starting to, similar to how task groups are working, really starting to look at the different pathway strategies and actions from various subcommittees that have been pulled into these cross-cutting groups. And yeah, they're going to be continuing that work. It's going to look a little different for each subcommittee as they continue on that path. And thanks to those on this subcommittee who are hopping into those groups as well. But that's kind of the update. As far as I know, there was a question around the presentation and touching on cross-cutting groups. I mean, this work really did just start and it's ongoing. I think what might be helpful for the public at this point is just know that these meetings are public and they're going on. So if they're of interest, like they could visit our website for any of these cross-cutting groups across the different issues here.
Yeah, I think just knowing for the business one, I 100% guarantee workforce is going to come up. So I think it would behoove us to like include that. Even if it's just, hey, this group is just starting. I mean, there are folks on our subcommittee who will be at those events who are doing that cross-cutting workforce discussion. So I'm kind of answering my own question. I think we need to include it.
Yeah, we don't have any like it's like very beginning stages. So you include that they're meeting.
Yeah.
We just don't have necessarily a ton of work to put out to them quite yet.
But the same way we're doing it with like the rural resiliences specific pathways, we can include the 2021 pathways, that the workforce pathway and the compact settlement pathway, the same way we're doing it with the other stuff, right?
All right.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, that's the update.
Good, thanks. Hi, David.
Hi,
Thanks for joining us. Appreciate you.
very happy to be here.
Do you wanna tee it up or do you want me to? And
I'm happy to say a few words. I mean, the intention here was in this meeting to try to get the full subcommittee's eyes on really the critical conversations that are happening in the task groups. And that's obviously a slippery slope because you can spend a lot of time on any individual task group. However, we think it's interesting to try to do that kind of in a high level summary way and somewhat conversationally in the subgroup. And so I was going to help you all do that across your three different task groups. I'm a little bit unclear what just happened in the last hour, but that's okay. But what we talked about was how can we help each of the task groups really say, this is the real tricky piece or the real interesting piece that we're working on. We're close. This is what's challenging for us right now. This is what you can expect from us when we start to lift it up to the full subcommittee with all the content. That was my vision of this, and I don't know if you want to add on that, Melissa.
no, I think that's great. Providing the direction of the task groups and really, yeah, focusing on what has you spinning that you keep coming back to and talking about more and can't seem to get off of and seeking input of others in helping that or just providing input on those types of things. And again, keeping it high level. We certainly don't have time to go into all the actions, but I think it's also a good point to think about as we go through, like, we have a lot of actions. And I think I've been kind of saying this all along, thinking about how to make this, I think the prioritization process that we'll go through helps, but how to be, I don't know, more succinct in what we're trying to get across, so that we can be more focused and more results oriented in what we put forth to the council to consider. So just kind of thinking about that as we go too.
Yeah.
I think I will share my screen because I think infrastructure and the built environment is up first. And I think Val needs to leave at some point here. So hoping we can get through that.
Great. And again, my role here is I'm going to just help prompt with some questions or pushing folks along. And so what, just Andrea, just real quick, you're sharing what exactly? You're going to share the pathways as they stand right now?
We're sharing, kind of created this template. I think public health and infrastructure will use this sort of template. And community support will use something a little different to get their update across. Basically just saying, like, a reminder, this is what this task group is working on and sort of where we're going, things that we've been thinking about along the way and sort of the direction that we're going. Again, not being like super detailed, maybe leaving some of it up to people to just read the slide while we're talking, but feel free, David, to chime in and help us along if we're getting too bogged down, realizing that we have 3 groups to go through and it would be good if we can wrap this up by 3:30 or so, this part.
Great. Okay,
I'll
well, let's
just
dive
add
in.
that different members of the task group filled out different slides. So they're even with amongst our task group, they have a little bit of different focus just to keep things interesting. I'm happy to kick it off. So I think just broadly, the main challenge the task group has been facing has been more administrative rather than substantive in nature, just getting us all together at the same time on the same date to review these actions, of which there are many, but that was our first step, was to go through the pathways and obviously, like everyone else has done, assign pathways and actions to the right task group. Some high level questions that I've come up with, again, non-substantive, like what do we do with being implemented actions? Do those remain? How do we address those? And how do we move actions that we've flagged for another task group or even another subcommittee? how do we move those off of our plate? Is that our job or my job to get those to the right people? And then we do have specific action items, which we do have questions about that could benefit from subcommittee input. Our biggest struggle has been on the wastewater and water actions, stormwater and wastewater, because we didn't have any expertise on our task group, but Ann Margolis sent out an email to DEC for their review, and they gave us some quick turnaround, and I see we have an upcoming meeting with them to further refine those action items.
I can
Does
probably put that.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
What was that, Chris?
I can probably help with that too. We've been kind of up to our neck in wastewater, so.
That doesn't sound good.
Yeah, no, Val, can you give just a quick overview, like how many pathways are you all working on right now in this? I can't tell from the slides here, but like what's the sort of big picture here? You got what, 3 or 4 pathways? What is it?
We have 3 pathways, and I think pathway 15 is like pathway 15A, B, C.
Why did we do these things? Anyway, okay, great. So it's more like 6 if you do, or 5 or something. Yeah. Great. Okay.
Yeah.
So 5 pathways, in there, a bunch of strategies, in there, a bunch of actions under them. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Pathway 15 and then pathway 17 and 18, is there, or 17A and B? Yeah, it's the
I think
strategy.
it's 17A, B.
Yeah. So it's I think 2 pathways really. And then a bunch of strategies.
Sorry, 15.
15 and 17.
That's right. 16 is not us. Yeah. Okay. 15 and 17A and 17B.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Anne, do you want to just kind of give a real, like, couple minute overview of this one?
Yes, and Chris, we will forward you the meeting that we're having with Neil Kamen of DEC next, it's lunchtime, but it's next Thursday lunchtime, I believe. There's a chance you can join that. And Mike has also reached out to the executive director of the Vermont Rural Water Association, try to get input there. So trying to plug the holes in our expertise here for infrastructure. But so this is strategy 15A under pathway 15. Overall, this is about proactively and strategically investing. I think we're questioning here, the word invest is highlighted here because we have some questions about whether that's sort of the right verb or captures all, whether it means monetary investment of personnel, time, other types of resources, but in general to invest in resilience, in transportation, communications, water, wastewater, and energy infrastructure. And so this strategy 15A is basically about policy planning and organizational foundational steps to take so that effective investments in infrastructure resilience can sort of roll off of that underlying foundational framework, policy and planning framework. Generally, as Andrea was saying, we have many actions, and we're trying to figure out which ones are redundant with each other, which ones are too general. A lot of these actions we looked at and said, what does this really mean? Who is the actor here? Who is supposed to do this work? What is the work? So in addition to trying to clarify those questions so that these are meaningful actions to somebody reading the plan, we're trying to understand which ones are duplicative. There are some that sound really like other ones, and we're trying to understand if there's a nuance there that justifies having separate actions. And there are a couple maybe at least one under this strategy that we were suggesting moving to another task group, which is appropriate here to discuss. I think one, it's number 9 here. It's basically land use regulations. I could read it aloud or put it in the chat, but it's essentially encouraging adoption of low impact development regulations. And it gets very specific around regulations about low water usage, landscaping practices, also density of development outside of flood prone areas. So I think we were talking about maybe asking the community task group to adopt this to the extent the group is thinking about land use regulations. So I don't know if we want to talk about that right now or you want me to move on. Pause for a sec if there's reaction.
That's jargon for stormwater.
You got to speak up a little bit, Chris.
Sorry.
That's jargon for stormwater, low impact development. So that could probably be, I don't know what the other ones are. It could probably be consolidated with something else. That's just part of like good compact development practice, right? You know, you can mitigate stormwater. So sorry, I'm just saying, I think that could probably be consolidated with something else. Where I see down here 18, 19, I'm just seeing something else about stormwater down here. So
Yep.
Yep.
I just put it in the chat so you can read it and determine what it means to you. There is this last bullet here talks about a number of source water protection, but also stormwater management recommendations. And hopefully we can get into this in this specific meeting on water and wastewater actions, which are a bunch of the actions that we've adopted without having sort of the internal expertise on our task group. But we are trying to figure out, you know, how, to what extent are water and wastewater, so what water protection and stormwater management, you know, there are actions that sort of speak to both of those. And we don't understand, I think, to what extent that omnibus action is, you know, is necessary because those two elements are related, right? How you manage stormwater affects your source water quality and supply. So we're just having some trouble seeing if it's even possible and rational to disentangle the water protection and then stormwater management actions from each other. But hopefully we can do that next week.
to actually clarify, actually seeing that one, now that I see the whole quote there, that's a hot mess of stuff there. So
A lot of that.
it should, so yeah, I mean, honestly, probably if a small, I'm not necessarily volunteering myself, but I probably need to be in it. I mean, if a small group of us were to go back and look at these things again, we could probably consolidate them, streamline them, and reduce the hot messes that we've got, because that one's a big ball of hot mess right there.
Yeah. I think
Which is what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
I mean, are we doing it right now?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't want to do it right now. What I will say is this is perfect, right? Because you're identifying that there's the work that needs to happen, right? The work that needs to happen is the increased density outside of flood-prone areas. Like that's the land use conversation, the cross-cutting piece that, you know, Liz was just talking about. That needs to go over there, right? The stormwater stuff needs to go wherever you're talking about stormwater and things, right? So help yourselves just sort of like get into those buckets and figure out where that conversation needs to happen.
Yeah, I had that question, like, appreciate thinking about the community capacity and planning group. I don't know, Scott or Bronwyn or Otis, we're not really talking about like land use regulations in that. We're really talking about like, what are those capacity and support structures that help municipalities do any kind of adaptation activities, which could include land use, but we're not getting into the details of like, what should land use and site design regulations include, stormwater and other things. And so to David's point, like maybe that does need to go to the compact settlement group instead, which I don't know, Liz, I guess that's kind of a question more broadly about like, how do we shift actions out of the subcommittee?
Yeah, we have a number that we'd like to shift out.
Yeah.
I mean, a whole pack.
Well, anything land use related, feel free to bring right into that land use cross-cutting conversation. That's entirely appropriate way to go. Bronwyn?
Yeah, I was just going to say that on first gut reaction is like, yeah, if it's a compact settlement related thing, if it's compact settlement related, then yes, cross-cutting. However, I will also say if there are stormwater you know, the cross-cutting is really focused on land use, and from what I know in that group, they might feel like, well, water and wastewater systems might be a little out of, there's a lot of like hot potato, I feel like, going on because people are trying to figure out like, well, who is focused on this stuff? And I think that's just kind of the nature of how difficult it is to approach this work when you're splitting it up into these different pieces. anyway, yeah, so I think we can toss it there and see what happens. I'm in that group, so I can try and advocate for where that, for
Yeah.
that group, but.
A good thing might be to just, have this meeting with water and wastewater folks next week. If Chris, if you can join that, I think it'll be great. And then maybe it won't even stay. Maybe it'll get lumped into something else, and then we can sort of regroup when we have a better sense of the direction on those specific actions and say, this really does belong in what is it called? The land use. Yeah.
The land use stuff, yeah.
Yeah, so then make that recommendation or frame it up a little bit better. So I think we've got a little time to think about.
Yeah, there's a request from Val to fast forward to the pathway 17 stuff. And I think that's great. If Val, we're going to lose you. And then we'll circle back to the other pieces of pathway 15 if there's other strategies there. But this is the level of conversation I think we should get to. I don't think we should go much deeper than this anyway.
Right.
Val?
Well, this is a good segue because interestingly, Pathway 17 is about changing Vermont's land use policies so current and future land development is adaptive and resilient to climate change impacts. Under Strategy 17A, the action items are largely related to water, wastewater, and stormwater, which is where we've gotten DC's input. Before that, we were seriously struggling to figure out. There were a lot of actions that seemed duplicative. DC input yesterday actually helped us match. There's some action items under Pathway 15 that are repeated under Strategy 17 and contained some recommendations for how we could either remove or adapt some of those so they're not duplicative. We haven't been really talking about new actions to consider. There was one in the notes that seemed to get DEC's thumbs up as a potential new action item to consider, and that's in italics at the bottom of the slide, to consider using some kind of funding, state or federal funding, to complete feasibility assessments at wastewater treatment facilities to make them more resilient in the event of an extended power outage. So a feasibility assessment that assesses opportunities, benefits. It's basically an economic and emissions assessment for the cost of increasing resilience at wastewater treatment plants through solar and storage, biogas and storage, or standalone storage, for example, or other clean energy options to improve resiliency there.
Want me to pop down?
Do you want to comment on 17A?
Okay.
So on 17A, I remember this one. It's like we took all the land use policy stuff, spaghetti, and threw it at the wall, and it landed there.
Did it all stick?
And so really, I mean, the gist of this really is that in order to achieve adaptive and resilient communities, they need to be compact in nature. In order to have compact settlement, you have to have sewer, water, you have to have this infrastructure. I just figured there's gotta be a better way there's a way that we can just simplify this as opposed to throwing out all the climate disruptions, equitable, blah, 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 blah. It's just, I mean, if we just could drill down into achieving compact settlement, growing compact settlement up and away from flood hazard areas, and investing in the infrastructure to actually make that possible, that could probably really shorten that strategy or pathway. And then the other related one, and I think we tried to capture this before, and I'm just not remembering, but certainly, based on all the flooding experience we've had, I think more people realize the other side of the compact settlement coin is conserving as much large forest blocks, meadows, everything else, floodplains, to buffer climate impacts as much as possible. So it's not like it's a yes and situation where you have to plan for and have the infrastructure to support the compact settlement, and then we really need to be keeping as much impervious surface development and other things out of the other areas where you don't have that compact settlement. I just think that we may be able to distill these pathways and other things into less language. Because it's not that, we don't have to throw all the stuff at it. But anyway, that's just my thought, and maybe it's bad, I don't know.
It will be great to have your input next week if you can make it, or perhaps we can find another time. That your comment, Chris, is that correct?
Yeah.
Reminded me of a high level comment DEC made on the actions, is that what seemed to be missing is an emphasis on first reducing stormwater, and that most of our actions are on improving, expanding, et cetera, existing facilities to be able to handle more, whereas maybe our focus should be on how do we reduce what's going in. So just a high level takeaway from quickly looking through the notes that came in last night.
Okay, great.
I have to hop in a few minutes, so I can quickly go over, this next slide, strategy 17B, which is not wastewater related. These are actions and a strategy that we actually have not addressed simply because we haven't gotten that far down the spreadsheet, but we must have early on, there were 3 action items under this strategy, and the comment there was if the 2 of the actions under this strategy are saying the same thing, and I don't think we had the expertise on our task group to address that. So there's this fund ARAF for non-federal disasters in towns that have adopted floodplain and or river corridor bylaws and support the 25% non-federal match for buyouts, and develop criteria for distribution when funding is limited. The question for that one is, does this remain under infrastructure or move to communities? And then the next bulleted item, that's where the 2 italicized action items seem similar enough that they could be combined into one.
I'm pretty sure we're talking about this in capacity, like those were assigned to us, so there might be some confusion about who's the lead on particular actions, because I know like Caroline's taking the lead on revising these in our task group.
Yeah, I think the first one did say community, and the second two or three, the last, or thought it said infrastructure, but we're happy to let you take anything.
But it's, anyway, we're working on those.
Okay.
It's got, I believe, all of those, so happy to take those.
Okay, because we really haven't gotten to them because we've been so engulfed in the other one. So, okay, that's good.
Great.
On this anyway.
Okay, great. Val, did that give you the clarity you need?
Just wanted to clarify, it's this first one, this fund ARAF that goes to communities, and have the other 2 also gone to communities?
Yeah, all of them.
So all of 17.
Thanks.
I can double check, but I think Caroline, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we're covering all of those.
I'm pretty confident that we cover all of those, yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And just for our task group, so I took notes directly into our spreadsheet on everything we've covered so far. So there's note of it. And I have to go. Thank you all.
Thanks, Val.
Thanks, Val.
Bye.
Okay, great. So we'll circle back to 15. And sorry, I misunderstood when Val was talking earlier about sort of pathway 15 ABC. It's just pathway 15, pathway 17, and you've got a couple strategies under each. Got it. Super clear.
Yeah, and I'll try to just do this really quickly because I know we're starting to go over what should be our time. Yeah, 15, that proactively and strategically invest. Let's see, there was only one action under the strategy, and that one action only partially addressed the strategy. So we are basically proposing that the action become, let me make sure, that the action become the strategy, and that we kind of regroup some of the other actions from other strategies into this one. I know that's really kind of confusing, but basically it was saying strategically integrate planning and preparedness across disciplines. I will say, if we do this, we don't really have any actions in our purview right now that are speaking really pointedly at preparedness or response. So I kind of wanted to get some input from folks in the task group, in the subcommittee about how they feel about that, or if it's covered elsewhere and we're okay, or I don't know, I just wanted to kind of get some input on that. So maybe I'll pause there for that input. I don't feel like we have a lot about planning. I also think there was a comment yesterday in the buildings in Thermal about like, seems like there's so much money for studies and planning and not enough money for implementation. So like, I don't know, if we're just like a bunch of planners and like to talk about planning, but yeah, how do we kind of
On preparedness, there's whole plans.
there's preparedness plans, but
Well, but not just that, I mean, the Eric's on, I mean, there's not just plans, I mean, there's structures, there's incident command structure, there's.
right.
there's-
Right, we don't,
we've got
I
a lot
don't
of
think we really
practice.
get into that, because this said, should be prepared to respond to and recover quickly. I don't think we have anything that's really addressing the recover quickly in these actions as they stand. And do we want to? Because I'm just putting it out there, so is that something that we should be thinking about?
Right.
Creating new actions around?
Right.
I don't know if VEM has any input on that.
Yeah, I saw Ben Rose and Caroline came off.
Yes, oh, hello, I'll comment. We've had 8 federally declared disasters in the last 2 calendar years. So, we're training all the time in real world. And there are a lot of Vermont officials getting pretty good at this. I mean, we're dancing as fast as we can. And the FEMA Public Assistance Program under the Stafford Act does actually a pretty great job of supporting communities in public infrastructure recovery. And each time we go through one, we take the opportunities that the law affords to build back with a little more resiliency. And it's painful and it's complicated and it drives overworked local officials crazy, but it is a great federal law. And we take full advantage of it in Vermont, and we get help that most states don't get because we're such a tiny state that we have a low threshold. So, you know, we're the size of a little quadrant of Ohio that might get clobbered just as hard, and they don't hit the statewide threshold, so they don't get any federal help. Whereas we get a baby disaster declared for a couple of $1 million. It doesn't help Green Mountain Power. I see your face, Mike, but for municipalities at least, most states wish they had our public infrastructure recovery problems.
Yeah, okay, I think that's good. I wonder if there's any pain points in those processes that come out and.
No pain points.
Nothing, it's all perfect.
It's all perfect, yeah.
All perfect. So, but here's the rub, right? So for you all as a subcommittee and task group, trying to say what really needs to be said about preparedness and ability to respond quickly, like what needs to be said in
Nothing. We have
2024?
other things we need to be talking about that are more capable of bending the curve.
Okay, Chris and Marianne both seem to have their hands up here, so I just want to give them an opportunity.
Where the gaps are, just because that FEMA PA structure doesn't exist as robustly as, with the individual and family recovery, that or you call it household recovery level, that's harder. And in the absence, I mean, we've had a couple of federally declared individual assistance disasters or more than a few, which is kind of unusual for Vermont. But a lot of ours going forward, like the ones we had in 2021, are not going to ring the federal bell. And so you're not going to have that federal infrastructure coming in to support it. So it's all going to be on us. And the structure is really volunteers, philanthropy, and others. And so that's where the big gap is. I think we've learned a lot, and we do really well on the public side. It's that individual and family side where we really need to figure out what our policy is, which even if the policy is there is no policy, I know that's not going to be the case, but then at least you know how to prepare for it, right? Because you can't count on FEMA coming in with $750 and $10,000 every time, because that's not going to happen every time. So so that to me is where the gap is. So I would just suggest continue to invest in and bolster our existing public recovery framework and develop an individual and family assistance recovery framework.
Right, and Caroline has her hand up too. So that sounds like a very concrete suggestion that may help shape this. Caroline, when you hear that, what does it make you think?
Well, I was going to say the same thing pretty much. We yes, Ben and his team are doing a great job in recovery, though Ben is leaving us, so we don't know what's going to happen after December. But yes, I would say that the individual assistance side of things is what's really failing our Vermonters. So in Addison County, for example, you can have a lot of people that are impacted by a disaster, but because we're so rural, we're going to have a really hard time meeting thresholds for IA assistance as individual assistance. So there needs to be ways that we're bolstering our ability to help people, help them walk through the system, case management. That's all really essential because people are not coming out of this hole, and we're going to start seeing the impacts of that on our communities. And I wish that Eric was still here because he could speak to preparedness a little bit more if there was something we wanted to add there. But I think it's worth a conversation to see if there is anything that could be addressed there.
Real quick, well, agree with Chris and Caroline, and then what Ben said too. And I think the other piece, the individual needs is a gap. I think also support to businesses is another gap. And so I think you could take that same pathway around sort of investment in particular. You know, this is, I think, gets to Chris's initial point of like the GWSA didn't really include individuals and households in any sort of definition about what rural resilience needs to cover. I mean, you can almost like talk about that as a particular sector that we need to enhance preparedness for, and the same goes for businesses. We don't have the same support structures, you know, for some like the municipal utilities, yes, but for other kind of private businesses and stuff, that's a challenge. And I think to Andrea's point in the chat, I think that like we're kind of getting at, and I'll make some notes, but like these are key questions we maybe want to ask in our stakeholder meetings, our focus group meetings. You know, if we kind of have a question mark around like this pathway doesn't have many actions under it, like what do you think is missing? I think that's a key one to ask. The other thing, I heard this morning from a colleague who was at a meeting with a bunch of farmers yesterday, who they were really sort of lamenting the issue of every time there's flooding, gravel from the roads ends up in their fields and they can't get it out, or it's difficult to get out. I don't know all the details, but I think we're starting to hear about these particular, almost like a short-term cascading impact of like, okay, we have our transportation infrastructure in many rural places, it's dirt, you know, gravel roads, those get washed out. I think, as we all know, in many of our flooding events, our roads just become waterways. And particularly in places like Addison County and others where you have a lot of ag land on roads, that debris is ending up in their fields, and farmers are really, it's the cyclical thing of like having to get it out, get it back on the roads. Who does that as a
Marion, I'm just gonna interrupt you because we gotta keep moving this train. Sorry, Marion, to interrupt, but
all right. I just raising it as sort of an additional thing to consider beyond just like the specific infrastructure system.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Mike, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to mention, Caroline mentioned if Eric was here, and we do work pretty well on the respond piece of it. We already have GMP, for instance, embed somebody right into the Vermont Emergency Management Operations Center. And I know other utilities do the same. We already work incredibly closely with the VTrans as well as local road people during the response. And I think we have that down pretty well. And I do think what everyone else is pointing out, the recovery part is maybe where we have to continue to work. We just had our annual Vermont Emergency Management emergency meeting last week. So that continues and is ongoing.
Okay. All right. So, and Alice had her hand up, but had to go. I don't see her now. All right.
No, I was just going to reinforce the conversation about reaching individuals. And I think that has to get down into the municipal level, and it has to get down into helping municipalities make sure that they have a good emergency management program.
Thanks. Okay. So the takeaways from this 15B is that fundamentally there's positive things happening on the public side, the municipal side. There's these gaps that need to be invested in on the individual household and business side. There may be some specific shout outs you do, such as what Marion's talking about farmers. But that seems like the input on how to help shape that. What's up next? Is that all that infrastructure has, or is there a little bit more on the infrastructure side?
I think we should move on.
Okay.
Just to close a gap, a specific act, just so it doesn't get lost. Ben, on the item you just mentioned, this is a huge deal. Now it's become a huge deal. Model municipal driveway standards would be a huge action item. So that way towns could just adopt them.
You said driveway?
Yeah. Yeah, towns can adopt driveway standards for private property. So, yeah.
And those standards do what, sorry? What are they?
Help with what already exists, but it could help us with future development.
Okay. Great. All right, so that's infrastructure and some of the things they're working on. That's great. Let's move to the next one. Who wants to be up next?
Scott's up next. Community.
Public
Yeah.
health, good.
Or
Okay. Do you hear that? Alice said she could go.
If I could have my slides up to share,
okay.
because I can't find my sheet.
I think they're in the document.
I have three. And I will say that I worked on these up until 15 minutes before the meeting. This was my crushed week. And what's interesting about talking about disaster recovery is what I got diverted on is a town bridge that may collapse. And we've been hustling to get that fixed. And that all happened along with the floods in July. Anyhow, what I did was, first of all, David had sent me an email and asked me to talk about, just give him a quick update on what our main issues were that we were working on. And he seemed to like them. So when I did the slides, I went forward with those. And our main issues we've been looking at are mental health services, not to flood victims and communities, not just after a flood, but there are people worried about every raindrop that begins to fall now. We're concerned with emerging diseases, viruses, vector-borne illnesses, climate change, and warming temperatures are having a direct effect of that. For example, Vermont added 17 days to what's known as the mosquito season this year. And we led the nation in that increased number. Our main hazards we're looking at right now, and it's in this slide, public health, how climate change has affected health. We're looking at flooding, air quality, types of air quality issues we have, water quality. I have water quality twice because we're looking at cyanobacteria, which is your green algae, waterborne viruses, vector-borne infections and diseases, and increased temperatures add to those vector-borne bacteria. And we're looking very seriously at the mental health needs. And the strategy would be to identify and communicate the risks to public health, flooding, damage to property and persons, the infectious diseases, drinking water, mold, and effects of smoke. We've got to figure out how we track this information and get it out there in a timely way, right down to the municipal level. Let's go to the second slide I have. And here's our next big thing that we keep coming back to is our messaging. I mean, we feel very confident that the Department of Public Health and ourselves have identified the hazards we're most concerned with. The Department of Mental Health did a study in 2017, I believe, where the department looked at and said, what are going to be the biggest hazards we're going to be looking at as climate change moves on? And they just happened to be the ones that we iterated in our first two meetings. So we know the problem is we looked at all the positive things that are happening with our communication. And then the strategy here, 1, 2, and 3, are discussing how we can enhance that. And what I'm looking for here is this point about forming a community network, and that's identifying the local organizations that are in the various municipalities and in the region that can become part of the network that can reach out to individuals and communities where people cannot just feel that they have to wait for a presentation, but that they can come to get the information. We're looking at our Department of Public Health regional offices to be able to advertise and promote more for individuals. And so we have some very specific ways we're looking at. We're also looking at using VT Alert to send public health messages out. Like, for example, I've been getting the fire hazard information daily. And in the case of high fire alert, I've been posting that right to our front porch forum. So, and I've had interesting inquiry from, we have a group in town that's a volunteer effort in town, and they take care of local parks, town parks, and town swimming holes. And they would like to develop a template based on information from the Department of Health when there are floods or heavy rain events, and what are what's the 48-hour rule of not going back in the water till it clears out? What are some of the hazards you may find swimming, like what's under you, what's beneath you? So that's been a good thing. So and the one thing we're saying is, if people in town want information, who are they going to call first? And that's going to be their town offices. So we're looking at more, how do we get the communication correct and able to be disseminated by town offices. We also have a big issue about making sure, and I put that down in the bottom here, our challenge here is how to reach rural and remote communities and how to reach the homeless population, marginalized communities, and towns without good internet access. So that's our challenge. How do we pump up their knowledge? And then the last one, my third one, I put
Third
this
slide.
yeah, the third slide. I put this in as a marker because I believe this, and we've been already talking about it. To me, this is cross-cutting with our infrastructure task force goals and strategies, which is in housing development. But we recognize that it's important for people to have safe, accessible, energy efficient, and affordable housing. We're looking at healthy housing. We're looking at the issues that occur not just after a flood, but we've talked about the pre-existing houses, the ones that are already there, that because of how they're structured, and I've talked to a housing person who has said, you can tighten up your house, but you've got to also make sure that you're not tightening it to the point where you're not letting any air in, because you're causing new problems. So we need to proactively invest in resilient housing, not just when we build it, and my slide's a little messy here because I was madly putting it together. But also, we need to review our building codes, build sustainable and resilient housing, and more help, expand and fund the help that's already out there to address these health issues with existing housing. Because it
Okay,
is.
great. Alice, thank you so much. And you have kind of a complicated task because public health wasn't as covered, and so you're sort of making some new things here.
Correct.
I think one of the things that immediately comes to mind is like, okay, how does all this translate into either new pathway strategy action or some handoff to a group that's looking at it? Like, for instance, the housing piece, Liz Ambler can help me, and Marion too. Like, there were housing pieces in the existing plan, and certainly the thermal group is looking at, and the buildings folks are looking at code and housing and all that stuff. So how do we
I
draw the
put it
links
in
there?
here.
Yeah.
I put it in here because we've discussed it. We've
Yeah.
already discussed at our last meeting, handing it off. And
Okay,
that
super.
the role of public health task force, however we continue to exist, is more advisory.
Great.
So they
Well, you can,
put us-
yeah. You can send a couple sentences in a paragraph or two over to the thermal folks and say, this is how we're thinking about it and what's important to us. Yeah.
Exactly. I just put the marker there so I remembered.
So thank you, Alice, for that. So some reactions to that, about how this gets translated into pathways, action, strategies, actions, feedback for Alice and the group there. Chris?
So I'll throw out, this could be a specific action. So the UVMs, they either have or are about to wrap up the zoning atlas. The project I'm working on is mapping where all the wastewater lines and where all the wastewater systems exist. And
yes,
once we overlay that with the flood hazard areas, the stories it's going to tell is going to be absolutely horrific. Because that's what that will tell is the story of where we actually have the infrastructure to develop housing at scale.
Yep.
So an action could actually be identify where infrastructure exists to support housing development at scale. And then we can figure out whether it's investment planning, whatever language we want to use, necessary to further to develop all future housing out of flood hazard areas.
exactly.
And
And I just,
the other one, of course, is I don't know that the Act 250 reforms are going to fix this, but at all. But the default development pattern continues to be large lot, single family development off of rural roads, and that's not good for anybody. So,
although, Chris, can I put a pause on that? Because that's clearly what the compact settlement conversation needs to be over in that group, right?
yeah, I guess that's what I'm saying. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And then, but I think it's a recognition of, So yeah, I'm happy to think of more language on that. I think I'm answering, trying to deal with the question.
for wastewater, I would worry about clean water, which we have in here, because of overflows of wastewater treatment plants, in recent flooding and, actually destruction of them completely, pipes ripped up. So, that's a health issue.
Right. I guess we're saying the same thing. I mean, I think.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, what I'm suggesting is we're in a bad situation.
Yes.
So on the piece of the infrastructure, the connections between wastewater and public health, I mean, you all are having this conversation next week about water and wastewater.
Yeah.
Is there a way in that conversation to talk a little bit about public health impacts and how that might weave all together, right? Because fundamentally, it's a question about the infrastructure and the impacts of what happens when it fails and produces health risks, right?
Yeah, and it's not just a matter of failing. There are also, what's known from DEC as allowed, discharges into rivers and streams. And
Okay.
those are a concern also.
Okay.
I mean, the strategies we have in there are separating them. It's to try to address the issue so that it doesn't happen. So I think that does cover the health portion of it.
Mhm.
Right.
I put a link to a webinar I was listening to. There's it's the climate group. I find all these webinars that I get in my emails, and I put a link in. It's a very good one with a reporter from New York Times interviewing two scientists, and one from Harvard and one from Notre Dame. And they were talking about housing and disasters. And the part I was interested in was the infrastructure part that group might want to listen to, where they're starting to talk about building codes that are now more. We call them building codes plus, and that what we need is more. A look at building codes and enhancing them. And I know that FEMA is doing this also right now.
Right. It's one of the question marks I've had, and maybe Liz Amler could help as well, is when we talk about building codes in the cross-sector group, it's often in the context of reducing emissions. There's a whole other set of conversations around building codes and the resiliency of homes and infrastructure. And I know that that's come up, and I'm not sure, Liz, how we handled that yet, or if we have handled it. But it clearly, the code conversation should have a little bit of both, right?
So just maybe this will help with an action item. I'm on the Building Energy Code Working Group. And one of the things that we're tasked with by statute is to identify whether or not Vermont should adopt a residential building code. Because right now, for single family detached and duplexes, there is no building code except for the energy code. So maybe a reference could be follow up on the report of the Building Energy Code Working Group. I mean, that may not sound sexy, but it's actual work that statute directed happen. So, and in my experience, it's okay to have in a plan an additional plan. In other words, like you don't try to necessarily deal with everything like in the plan. If you identify some other sub-plan that needs to be developed, you know, it could be like in land use plan, it could be outdoor recreation economy plan, or farmland protection plan, or something like that. We can always highlight those things. We don't necessarily have to solve it all on this one.
Yeah. Okay. Could we go back to the first slide? I'm a little confused about how this is a pathway and a strategy and an action. Because then you have communication, you communicate in your next set of strategies.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how this might be more of sort of preamble of these are the public health things where, you know, Vermont is grappling with or will be grappling with, right? And then the pathways are more about how do we understand them better, or how do we communicate them, or, you know, something like that. I'm just curious how people in the group have been thinking about this.
I agree it's a preamble. I'm kind of new at this kind of fishing around on how to organize it. So
Yeah.
it is the preamble. And we have 2 working spreadsheets right now that we've been refining and merging.
Okay. But if you really sort of to boil things down, Alice, like when you think about it from a climate action plan standpoint, from public health, are you, in addition to the good stuff around communication that we have on slide 2 and the issues around housing we have on slide 3, is there something else around understanding impacts more, or, you know, is there anything else that we're missing from like a strategy standpoint? And others jump in too.
I don't know if we got specific in any of the other ones about the mental health needs, and I feel like at any time, Alice, that you all have reported out on what you're talking about, that has been a big item.
Yeah.
And so maybe it needs to be,
I was planning on having, again, I apologize because I have to try and save a bridge in Waitsfield right now. But I did plan on having a mental health slide on its own. And I just didn't get to it. I'm sorry.
well, I think that's fine. I think what you like David said, you guys have a little different angle to come at this with because you're starting from scratch. And so to just get these
Yeah.
ideas there, that's the first step, and then refining them. I think it's great.
Yeah, and then we, like, we needed to kick off a conversation, so my strategy as chair was to just throw things up in a red spreadsheet and see what stuck, but it got the conversation moving. And
Super.
we have now been refining, and Jared Ulmer has been a great help in helping on the spreadsheet and what I was able to put together for slides for today.
Great. So I would suggest, and others weigh in, it seems like the next steps on this is really to think about sort of thematically how you want to organize things around strategies. And I'd even forget the pathway level for now, but just strategy, like what are we talking about? Like build out our capacity to deal with mental health challenges and other things, right? And another one might be how we communicate those things. And then the other one is like the basic ones around how we ensure safe housing is a sort of a baseline set of conditions for public health. So something like that, where you're able to like really delineate 2, 3, 4 big ideas, and then you can develop the kind of specific actions underneath them.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah.
Do others agree with that? Does that make sense to the subcommittee?
Yep.
Okay.
You got that, Ben and Jared? That's for our next meeting too.
Okay,
All
great.
right. Thank you.
Yeah, and Alice, I'll just put out there, if you all in your task group want any support from me in that, just ping me and let's see if my schedule aligns, and I'm happy to chime in and be helpful if that would be helpful.
Okay, great, David. Thank you.
You bet. All right, so last group. Who's left? Our community folks, right?
I'm sharing my screen, so give me just a second. Tell me where you want me to go.
Second slide. So, hello, everybody. So, I apologize. Was a little bit confused about what format to use. So, Marion and I discussed trying to condense our spreadsheet into a presentation that helps us move forward as a task group. Also, just for information, I put this together, but I'm looking for other people in the task group to supplement the conversation as we go along. First of all, just a quick one, task group scope, training capacity, strengthening funding as it impacts community capacity and planning, coordination of state municipalities and NGOs, increasing staff capacity and needs, technical support, policy as it impacts community capacity and planning again, education and public awareness. So this is what we've been focusing on. Next slide. Just quickly, who the group members are: Chris, Dahlia, Bronwyn, Otis, me, Carolyn, Candace was invited. She hasn't participated yet, and Marion. So please contribute as we move along. So using the template that the thermal group has used, thermal sector group used in their presentation yesterday, pathway for, well, first of all, we're looking at all 5 pathways. Pathway 16, which is the fossil fuel reduction, is being done in collaboration with the cross-sector mitigation group, and more probably importantly, the thermal sector task group. I've been volunteering to work with that group on integrating pathway 16 into what we're doing. So in terms of the first pathway, pathway 14, I think we've been able to come up with revised language and some revised actions for this. And pathway 14 has 4 strategies, A, B, C, and D. And we're looking at combining and revising 14A and 14B. So 14A, this is the proposed revision, is to provide tools, technical support, and permanent funding for local and regional climate resilience planning and project implementation to enhance resilience to the impacts of climate change. There are 5 proposed actions under this. Marion's been working on this. Develop a climate planning toolkit, expand capacity for the state to train on and support the use of the municipal climate toolkit through a development of education materials, technical assistance, and streamlined tools. Develop a municipal climate planning framework and guide that can be used to help integrate climate actions into their planning processes. Align the municipal planning and resilience grant program with the municipal climate planning framework and guide, and establish a permanent dedicated fund for regional planning commissions to cover overhead costs related to their application for and management of hazard mitigation grants. Now, the next slide just talks a little bit about why this is important. We had a number of conversations about not creating a necessary need to create new climate resistant plans, but a focus on existing planning processes. Municipalities already have a number of plans they're required to do either internally or by the state, and it's not necessary to introduce a new climate planning process. There are municipalities that have one, such as South Burlington has a climate action plan, but it's important to note that it's probably more important to introduce and integrate climate change resilience plans into existing planning processes. And then how do we support municipalities' use of existing tools and plans? And then, as I said, make it clear that we're not asking for new things. We're asking this for these to be used in support of existing municipal requirements. And then we mentioned that there would now be an action planning framework project. So next slide. As I mentioned, strategy 14B would be combined and revised with 14A. 14B talks about creating and funding a natural resource management position at every RPC to assist with the implementation of climate policies and natural resource requirements. We've had quite a bit of discussion about this, and we're hoping some of the RPC meetings will help clarify this. I've also reached out to a couple of RPC planners, energy and climate planners. So we have quite a bit of discussion about whether or not this is important, what the role would be, how to integrate with municipalities, how municipalities would integrate with households. I'm not sure we have a solution to this yet, but it's something that we're continuing to discuss. Next slide. This is 14B as well. This also relates to technical assistance to municipalities to assess flood and erosion risks and increase funding to RPCs and local municipalities to support climate energy planning and target funds to support towns with limited staff and marginalized populations that score high on a climate vulnerability index. And I think these are also related to the previous comment about the need to ensure that we have reliable support, either from RPCs or other regional organizations to municipalities, to be able to come up with and implement plans at the local level. Next slide. Increase and create a permanent state fund for design and implementation of local and regional climate adaptation and resilience projects. And we talked about this is a bit too broad, and it needs to be related more as a revolving fund for climate hazmat projects, and then establish a state level individual assistance program to provide financial assistance to uninsured and underinsured households. And this is something we wanted to discuss with Chris as we move forward. And it's something also we feel needs to be coordinated with the public health task group. Okay, moving on. Just quickly, the first one here, identify and develop new programs to address the full range of climate impacts, especially those that impact important climate industries. I think we talked about this already in terms of the business meeting coming up. It's important to talk to them about this as we move forward. We really don't have any ideas or solutions. The existing action under this is to develop or do an impact study for the tourist industry that involves winter activities primarily. Next. Sorry. It's okay. This is 14D. These are, first one has already been done. It's remote meeting options, including call-in option for all meetings for public bodies. That was done and completed by a legislative bill. The next one is, I think, important to bring up as a conversation. This relates to organization framework to facilitate integrating climate vulnerability assessment and adaptation and planning into municipal planning operations. And this is something that Bronwyn has been looking at. And I don't know, Bronwyn, if you want to have any discussion about this at this point.
Are you talking about the next slide, the housing?
No, not the housing. This is the one that basically looking at the framework for integrating discussions between state level and municipalities.
Oh, let's see then. I feel like, are they very different? 14C.
They could be integrated.
Yeah, the last cap 14D was really just about remote meeting options. So
Yeah, I wonder if it goes away, right?
Yeah.
Because if you don't
Well-
have another thing to do and it was completed, great, check, move on.
Yeah, and I'm
Okay.
sorry,
About this.
to-do list. I was really focused on housing.
Okay, I'll talk about this later then. Keep going.
you would know the next 15.
Pathway 15. Proactively and strategically invest in enhanced resilience in transportation, communications, water, wastewater, and energy infrastructure statewide.
Wait, hang on a second. Can I just pause for 1 second? Because didn't we just look at 15A with the other group?
Yes.
Yes,
Okay, so you guys are doing this in parallel?
it was listed as a joint activity. Okay.
Okay,
Yeah, I think, David, I think the strategies were split up between task groups. So like some of the strategies went to infrastructure and some of them under this pathway went to community capacity.
So some of it's hardcore infrastructure, the other side of it is capacity planning, community capacity and planning relevant to infrastructure.
I'm confused, to be honest, because I feel like this was all assigned infrastructure. 15A was all assigned to infrastructure.
I mean, that's, I'm happy, I think we're happy to,
I don't, unless it's different ones, but maybe, I don't,
well, this is going back to the spreadsheet that was.
yeah, that's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, we worked on in a meeting.
Yeah.
Fine. Like I was, the mission critical one, like, I'm pretty sure. Did we send it to Otis?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Maybe I'm looking, maybe this is part of the problem of like, if 15A for infrastructure has 15 lines and then community, like, it's just too much. There's gotta be overlap. It's just too much. I don't know. Maybe I'm just not looking at it right. Yes.
so, okay, so we had from the other group a quick slide that spoke about things that they would do or change to this. You all have done some detailed work on this. It sounds like this, maybe we just bring this right up the subcommittee level and do it there. I'm not sure. I'd hate to have two groups working simultaneously on this.
Did Anne still do? Is anybody from our desk? Maybe they're,
Yeah, and still good. I'll pull up the assignment spreadsheet.
that'd be great.
Sorry, but I gotta control for Scott.
Oh,
so.
okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just gonna pull up so I can share.
Okay.
Yeah. But I don't know if you want to keep going or if you want to skip this one and go to a different pathway.
We could use
I
it.
don't know if we
on the
need to
next
go
one.
through each strategy line by line.
No,
Yeah.
we could go to the next one. We'll come back and discuss this.
So,
Okay, this pathway 16 is the reduction of fossil fuels. As we've discussed at previous subcommittee meetings, this was assigned to the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee by the council. So it was decided that we would coordinate with the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. I was volunteered to have that role. I've attended one meeting of the subcommittee, one meeting of the thermal group task force, and I participated in the focus group discussion yesterday. I didn't discuss anything, I just listened. There's been good coordination so far between us. I'm not going to go over what the thermal group is presenting. That was done yesterday, but I will summarize quickly. I think most of what they're discussing within the thermal group is support to increasing weatherization and to a limited extent, also equipment related to heat pumps and heat pump water heaters. And I think that most of what they're proposing is either technical solutions or legislative stroke policy recommendations. The role that we could play is looking at the capacity, the planning, and the integration of some of their programming into other aspects of the climate action plan. So that discussion is ongoing. This is specifically relevant to the housing discussion, whereas there was a lot of discussion yesterday about weatherization and also future building codes, either the RBs or the CBs and statewide building code, Chris, and what impact that may have on affordable housing. So this is an area in which we can have further discussions with the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee. Okay, going on to 17. Change Vermont's land use policies so current and future land development will be adaptive and resilient to climate change impacts.
I'll just put up my red flag one more time. Like, okay, we looked at some of 17 already. Are we looking at different aspects of 17?
No, we're looking at things that were either assigned jointly between infrastructure and community capacity and planning.
Okay.
which is just those one, we talked about this, right? The ERAF one, and then the comprehensive state land use buyout program.
Yes.
That those were assigned to our group. So it's only 2 actions, I think.
Okay. Oh, these ones. Yep. Great.
You can go on to 18 and
Yeah, so it was 3, sorry, but yeah.
Pathway 18, ensure that all people have access to safe, accessible, energy efficient, and affordable housing. I'm going to make a summary here, but then Bronwyn, please jump in and compliment what I have to say. There are basically strategy 18A, update state and local land use governance regulations, practices, and investments to eliminate barriers to housing development. This was actually assigned, I think, originally to the public health task force.
Nope, I don't think so.
Yeah, we were listed on 18. Yes, we were on 18. 18, yeah.
I'm happy to take over because this wasn't my task list, and I am fully acknowledging that I just didn't make a whole lot of progress on it prior to this meeting. So if you'd like, I'm happy to kind of walk through some of the things that I've observed with housing.
Go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks all. I think housing has been one of those challenging things, again, back to some of the points being made earlier, where the Global Warming Solutions Act really didn't talk about individuals. And even in housing, I feel like housing is sort of approached as an asset that we can make resilient, as opposed to thinking about the people, where having access to having affordable, safe, energy efficient housing for everybody makes the people of Vermont and the communities of Vermont more resilient. So I just want to be clear that when I approach this, I'm not thinking about it from just how do we make the homes resilient, but how do we make people resilient through their access to housing? So my first, one of the first recommendations that I would plan to make is to change either the pathway or update one of the strategies to make it clear that these are strategies intended to help support the state meeting its goals for additional housing units that are needed per the housing needs assessment. So just to make it really clear that for again, kind of driving home that point that the reason we were talking about housing and resilience is because people need housing to be resilient and people need to be housed. And to do that, we need more housing units, period. So in that first strategy, update state and local land use governance regulations, practices, and investments to eliminate barriers. I'd also add eliminate barriers to housing development and support the creation of additional year-round housing units in line with the state's housing needs assessment. Some of the other things I've been thinking about within that, I think the biggest, I think the most important strategy at this point, there's been three, I'd say and welcome to have people jump in and provide some thoughts and other feedback, but I think there's been three pretty significant pieces of legislation that really do help remove the barriers to compact, affordable housing. There's the Home Act, recent revisions to Act 250, Act 181 that just passed, as well as the Flood Safety Act, which is all addressing sort of where housing can go. So we've been doing a lot of work in that, definitely still more work to do, but I think what we need now is to focus on training those builders who can then go out and build the housing that we just unlocked those barriers to. So that's an existing action that's in there. And I would just say that I would leave it as is and have it remain a pretty high priority in terms of being able to build climate safe, flood safe housing in line with goals. A couple of things have already come up in this conversation, so I'll just flag them as things that I've also been interested in. Mapping all of the exercises that are going on to try and figure out, to Chris Campany's point, where can we put new housing development that is flood safe, that does have access to water and wastewater. I think I would add a new strategy that just kind of generally talks about the need for data and analysis. I think the rental registry, if that is still of interest, the rental registry can slide in there. It's a piece of data that would help us better design programs to help make rental housing more energy efficient, weatherize it, make it more resilient, more safe, et cetera. In that data category, then we could also add things around mapping. I think the last ones are, sorry, go ahead.
Can I add one thing to that one just before we leave it? Is maybe an action item could be, we can wordsmith it later, but basically work with floodplain administrators or zoning administrators to identify when rental housing is lost. So it's really hard for us to track when any housing is lost, but I'm thinking especially for the floods, that's a big question we don't have an answer to right now, is how many rental units especially have been lost, and how many, and then over time with buyouts and walkaways and bringing properties up to NFIP standards and other things, how many units are going to be lost, because the floodplain administrators and the zoning administrators might be able to report that. It's a big messy concept. I don't know how we execute it, but we need to identify that. The other thing too, I love the rental registry. If we, and we're all talking about this now, but maybe we could add to the climate plan, is come up with a solid system by which to identify when housing is built. Because right now, in a lot of towns, you can build a property, you can build a property without anybody ever knowing it, other than a wastewater and water permit.
Yeah, and I'm not suggesting that this is passable. We've been many folks have been stabbing at some sort of a rental registry for years, although I would say sometimes it's for different purposes. I think one of the things that, without, necessarily speaking for the resources to do it, I think an inventory of housing that's being built, and I think that's kind of in tandem with a rental registry. We need to know what housing we have, and we need to know how it's being used, sort of who has ownership of it and who's living in it. A rental registry is not going to tell us about all the single family homes, or it's not going to tell us about condos, right? Because it really is just a rental registry, and rental status can change. So I think both of those things, having an inventory of housing that's being built, plus an inventory of those units that are rental, just having that information to be able to reach out to people, I agree, is pretty important.
Could I just add to that? I mean, we tried to develop a rental registry in Essex Junction last year. We spent a year working on it. It was not popular. In fact, it was very unpopular. We had the most public input into a council meeting in the history of the council, probably. And it's on hold, and it had a lot of the objectives that both you guys have been talking about. So I think that trying to figure out a way to make it more acceptable or beneficial would be a way to promote it. I'm basically saying a rental registry by itself is it needs to be further elaborated and discussed with the community about what the benefits are to the community. And I don't know if that would be an action or if that's necessary. Yeah. Also, the public health aspect of it. One of the things that we were concerned about is the public health aspect. The Department of Fire Safety, the Fire Safety Department is now responsible for environmental health in the state. It would be important to figure out how to integrate that into public health, as well as what was brought up in the meeting yesterday in the thermal group meeting is one person mentioned that weatherization from their perspective was not a climate change issue. It was more a public health and an economic issue for households. So trying to make this more palatable might be a communication strategy related to rental registry.
I was just going to say the data may already be out there too, a combination of the tax maps, and then Vermont Fire Safety already issues permits for any duplex or above. So before they can be energized. So something to think about there.
Great. Okay.
So sorry, can I just, so two other things that have come up in this conversation that I have been rolling around, but I'm getting to the stuff that's really tricky. So in terms of building codes, there's a lot of discussion, and I'm sure Caroline somewhere will pipe up and say this would also help with some other FEMA funding, but having a residential code period. I think there's a lot of, that's not just an easy, straightforward thing, but certainly from some housing developers, the idea would be, there's a lot of benefits to that in terms of our housing stock and knowing that, it is being built in a safe way, but it also evens the playing field. I just want to flag that a lot of, when we look back at that goal of housing units that need to come online and knowing that they need to be affordable, that's something that we're lacking. The affordable housing community is really feeling the strain of every sort of new challenge that raises the cost when it doesn't come with the funding to maintain their levels of housing production that they're trying to meet. So I think it would be worth talking about exploring residential building codes, making sure again that playing field is level. The thermal group I know is talking about supporting some of the work on enforcing the RBs and the CBs updating just the regular building code, et cetera. But you know, if I think there needs to be some kind of a recommendation to make sure that as we are exploring new code, that we are finding other ways to make the affordable housing developers whole so that they can continue to produce the numbers of units they need to produce with the funds that they are working with. Oh, and then the last thing, education, always. So in terms of thinking about capacity for municipalities, and someone else mentioned this already, is really developing some language and some materials to help municipalities really understand the connection between housing and climate. I mean, I think some communities are definitely getting it right now because they're looking at all the challenges of having lost housing, trying to figure out where it can go, looking at their tax base, looking at their wastewater, and realizing that their wastewater is going to need upgrading, but they're actually losing tax base to housing that's been flooded. So I think some of them are getting it, but having more materials and resources and education to help municipalities really see the connection between housing and climate would be helpful.
Okay. All right. Some really good things there. And you know, part of this is the coordination that needs to happen. For instance, that there's a clear message that needs to go to the thermal group around the affordability and the feasibility for particularly low-income housing developers to build the pace they need to do with changing codes. Like that message needs to get sent over there, and someone's going to need to have to think about how that shows up in the plan. All right, so this was, is there anything else? Sorry, from our community folks, is that it?
Can I suggest one discrete action item?
Yeah.
It would be, conduct a study to determine how many people were displaced from Vermont by the 2023 and 24 flooding. That's a justice and a housing issue. My hunch is, and it's very insidious. It takes place over years. So it wouldn't be something we have to do right now, but over time, I wouldn't be surprised if it's like 1,000, 2,000 people.
So Chris, in suggesting that, like, what is your goal? What happens once you have that number?
We understand the real impacts of what happened when we have catastrophic flooding as far as people actually having to leave the state because they can't stay in Vermont.
Okay.
That's a fundamental equity and justice issue.
We know.
Right. And it just doesn't exist now. People don't know.
No. And it's very insidious. It takes place over time because the buyouts are still happening. You have people living in substandard housing that they're just kind of toughing it out until they go through yet another winter and decide, well, we'd really like to have heat and water, that kind of thing. So it takes place over a long period of time. You look at all the disaster literature and see how long this takes for it to shake out. But it's something we should be tracking over the years to understand what the impacts are, because then that helps you plan for what the policy should be to better retain people. Because as we don't acknowledge it or don't understand it, then we're not going to be able to plan accordingly for it.
Got it.
And I also want to add that there are a lot of secondary, so in addition to the slow sort of insidious impacts, there's also a lot of the secondary impacts where your housing market shifts. And, you know, the rental community, I'm a renter, and I'm concerned that in Barrie, if there are fewer rental apartments on the market, my rent is going to go up, supply and demand, right? And that could potentially displace me. And I wasn't impacted by the flooding directly, but what it does to the cost of housing and demand for housing and rates going up, that there's a secondary impact there. If anybody hasn't listened to it yet, I highly recommend. There's a podcast called Not Built, and it is phenomenal at describing some of those cascading impacts of when disasters hit and what it does, not just to people and their housing directly, but to the housing market and displacing folks down the line. And it's really helpful to hear and understand.
So Bronwyn, maybe I'll work with you on this. Maybe it's a broader study that we propose. It's not just the displacement, but it's the housing impact period.
Yeah, that has to come from you. Chris will kill me if I suggest we do a study.
Okay.
Okay. we need to pause for public comment, see if anybody's been listening to this conversation, and then let's wrap up, and then we got one more thing to do. So I just want to pause for a second. If someone's been listening into this conversation, this meeting, and isn't a member of the subcommittee and would like to weigh in, let me just pause and see if we have anybody there. Raise your hand, or we're such a small group, just open up your mic. Any folks just listening in that would want to make a comment? Okay. Great. Okay. All right. So to wrap this, clearly this was a helpful exercise to do this in the full subcommittee. You could see across. I hope you took good notes and have some pathways to how to do this final work. There's only a handful of weeks left to get this going. So thanks everyone for really diving in. Like I say, I'm available if folks want some facilitation support in your task groups, whether it's public health or somewhere else. Just let me know if we can sync up schedules. I'm happy to be helpful in driving that forward. Okay. One other thing in terms of wrapping up. You all are going to have a handful of public input sessions. I don't have them right in front of me. I see Sophie's in the room there. She has those dialed in more than I do. But when those public input sessions are, I think one of the things we could do based on the conversation we just had, and you talked about this earlier today, right? The public input sessions.
Overview.
Yeah. So one of the things we could do to just wrap this up is just say, when you think about all the topical things we just went through as we went through the 3 task groups, are there things that are just screaming out for areas of focus for the public input sessions? Because we can direct those public input sessions towards, specific topics or ideas or issues. So I'm curious, when you think about, all the way through those 3 task groups, there's things you'd really want to hear from people about. Like, let's do a couple shout outs right now of that, because that can help shape how we facilitate those public input sessions. So topically, what do you think would really benefit? Maybe, and apologies, you guys already did this in your meeting.
No, I mean, we wanted to circle back at the end of the conversation to do just this and talk about, are there questions that specifically we want to try to get people to engage in? And I mean, I think one of the things that we talked about was individual, like business and personal assistance in terms of preparedness and response and hearing from people on that.
Yeah, that's what I've written down before.
Okay. Is somebody taking notes on this? Sorry, or do I need to be taking notes?
No, we have a note.
I have that.
Okay, awesome. Okay. All right, so that's one thing that sounds like it'd be pretty helpful. Are there other things topically that you'd want to really check in with folks on? Chris?
I'd love for their thoughts on how do we grow away from all flood risks. And I'm characterizing it that way because both inundation and fluvial erosion. And that's
Did you hear that? I only heard every third word. Sorry about that, Chris.
Sorry. Their perspective on how do we grow our communities away from flood risks.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, I think the same thing, like future existing development for housing and businesses or anything, right? That's the only other item I had written down.
Anything else that's jumping out for folks?
In terms of businesses, I'd like to just generally hear kind of what they want to do. Like, let's say there's a business that's in the floodplain or they're a corridor, if they could do anything, what would they do to solve their current problem?
And Caroline, a specific shout out to businesses there. Would you have a similar question to someone who lives there?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else?
This is maybe in addition to that one. I'm real curious based on either their own experience or that of others, what have they done or plan to do? So in other words, it's not just somebody should do something about this. It's what have they done? And I'm not putting it back on them, but because the answer may be, I'm at a loss. I don't know what to do.
Yeah, or what capacity do they have to do anything?
Yeah. Yeah, and it'd be great to hear from them and see if they have been creative and if we can help further that for other.
Yeah, and that could be everybody involved, just like maybe it's restructured. I'm sorry, I'm just thinking here. Maybe it's what do you feel like you need to do? What do you want to do? And then what really can you do?
Okay, we could try. That sounds a little tricky, but we
It
could
is,
try.
that gets to the point that,
Yeah.
the point of like, there's what have they done, but then like, what can they realistically, in their own lives, in their own business, what can they do?
Okay. Well, let's see when we get folks on the line, if we do have folks who have been in that situation or have a family member in that situation, and see if we have sort of a number of folks that could help us walk through that.
Well, I guess that's what I'm trying to avoid, is not just trying to talk to the people who've been through the disaster, because we're all gonna be through it. Right? Even if we don't live in a floodplain, our town, parts of our town are gonna flood.
Yep. It's true.
What are we doing at our own levels to plan for, it could be a wind disaster, it could be catastrophic power outage because of cement-like snows. What are we doing to plan for the next one?
Got it. Okay.
Respond to the next one. That's my take on it.
Yeah, that sounds like a bigger frame than what Caroline has, and that could be a good frame too. Yeah. All right. So there's one more thing you need to do in your meeting, which is talk about the Just Transitions rubric. And so why don't we wrap here? And thanks everyone for putting up with me remotely. And who's leading up the conversation around Just Transitions? Sophie, are you going to do that or someone else?
Danielle's gonna do that.
Danielle?
No. Thank you, and sorry to squeeze you on this. I don't want to be squeezed on this, but if nothing else right now, at least we get an introduction or a reminder or both to this, and then we can maybe put some more time into it next time too.
Yeah, okay. Can you pull up the?
I share that.
Okay, are we ready?
Go.
Go, ready for 10 minutes, go. Hello, everyone, Danielle Bombardier. I haven't officially introduced myself or met any of you officially, but I was in one meeting before. I'm on the Just Transition Subcommittee. I am a labor representative. I'm a union electrician and also high school trades instructor. So I apologize I haven't been here much. I work during your meetings quite often, but now I am on maternity leave, so I can be here, at least for a little while. I'll just say from this meeting, it's pretty clear that this group has made an effort to center and increase accessibility and community engagement. But hopefully this document can just further assist as well as help you center equity as you continue throughout the revision process. So if it's on the screen, the steps 1, 2, 3 on the first page, 4 and 5 on the second page. They are not necessarily linear, but they're the 5 steps of the Climate Action Plan revision process. Today we talked about step 4. I know you're going back into steps 2 and 3 over the next month. The ovals underneath each of the steps signify action areas. And the rectangular blue boxes are questions that come from the full guiding principles document that have been pulled out as most relevant and useful at each stage in the revision process. So if we look at step 1, the first checkbox there under step 1 in the oval is to review quarterly engagement reports. I don't know if this group has done that together or individually.
No, we've talked about them, but we haven't looked at them together.
It's definitely helpful to look at those. You are talking about integrating feedback from your sessions coming up. This is a way to integrate feedback that we've already heard from the community. So just taking the time, you can click on that link here in the document and it'll take you to the, I don't know what it's called, the portal. And you can search for engagement reports and they'll come up all the quarterly reports that CBI has put together. The second action, the checkbox, is to look at the community considerations checklist. And this is a checklist that shows the various groups of individuals that live in our communities that may be impacted or experience barriers as a result of some of the recommendations and actions. This is directly from our original guiding principles document, the kind of the list of marginalized and impacted communities. Asking whether your recommendations have impacts that are known on these communities, if they're negative, if they're not. And I think kind of taking this checklist out while you're looking at your pathways and action steps really holds at the forefront of your mind the groups that we're looking at, whether they're being impacted or not. So just even having it in front of you at the same time. The last action checkbox is what we did today. And what we just did, creating questions for the input sessions. So we're already well on our way here through step 1. Steps 2 and 3, this is where the subcommittee is now, the review and revision of strategies. I had no idea how much work everyone is doing with all of this. It is incredible. You definitely have a lot in front of you, and I appreciate you taking the time to incorporate these guiding principles. It's super important. The recommended action items in those circles, again, are to continue to reflect on public engagement and then reflect on what you hear from your outreach events. And if possible, to also participate directly in those outreach events so you can hear firsthand the community's reactions and concerns. And then these blue rectangles are the specific questions. So I won't go through each one, but I'll pull out a couple. The question of how have frontline or impacted communities been involved in designing strategies and actions, which I think is a really important piece. How have you made sure that those voices are heard from the beginning so that it's not a top-down approach, but a bottom-up approach for those action points? And I think this group recognizes that. I've heard discussion about that today. And then as well as the last point, if the recommendations are in plain language. So this is something Just Transitions talks about a lot, how to make information and resources accessible to everyone. I've heard it from public health. We just heard it with housing, making information accessible. Whether that means multiple languages, whether that means plain language, just making sure we know what, who's looking at the material and if it's understood. Let's see. I had a note, I heard in this meeting early, a question about whether action points would have context and written explanation when they're submitted to the Climate Council. Co-chairs for Just Transition have shared that other co-chairs have also struggled with the question of whether the action steps include the equity pieces directly in them, or if it's something that comes down the line, further conversation. So I don't think there's a real answer yet, but I think it's a good step that we're having that conversation and recognizing that we need to continue it to move forward, whether it's in your action step or after.
Yeah, I think that's great. If you think about the giant tables that are the appendices for the climate action plan, it does have a column for equity, right, or something. I forget exactly what it's labeled, but
So there could be some notes.
yeah,
on there.
and yeah.
The second page of that document, if you want to, yeah. Step 4 is the stakeholder events. That was this whole meeting. So I think we're all on board for those. The question of interest in the circle. How have you, or I'm sorry, in the rectangle, how have you really reached and intentionally included frontline and impacted communities in your outreach? Again, I heard today, people were asking, how are these meetings advertised? Who's represented at the meetings? How can you ensure all voices are heard? So I think you're asking the right questions. I would just add that maybe from step 1, take that checklist and see your list of invitees. And if there's any group that would be affected that's not included, make a direct outreach to that group. I also know Just Transitions was asked to add to all of the invitee lists. So some of that work has been done as well. And then step 5, check boxes, action items, really is about using stakeholder feedback to revise your strategies and building time within your subcommittees to connect with climate action public engagement team. So really taking the feedback and applying it. The particular question is, do your revised recommendations and strategies reflect and incorporate what you have heard from frontline and impacted communities? And if the answer is no, then the encouragement is, how can you revise it to be more inclusive? Just Transition Subcommittee is open to inviting your task groups with your actions to come to our meetings, ask questions, ask for feedback, and then additionally holding space on your agenda for myself or another liaison to answer any questions or provide feedback. The final questions in the blue boxes at the very bottom of step 5 ask about the metrics that should be used to track the impact of these recommendations on affected communities, and are those indicators of progress relevant to their needs? So are they the right metrics? The last page is just a resource page. So how to connect with us, who are our co-chairs, Abby and Kelly, and then our 3 staff support folks. And then it was shared in the last subcommittee meeting that Just Transitions is working with the Office of Racial Equity and the Climate Action Office to coordinate a training opportunity. So everyone involved in the Climate Action Plan work will have the opportunity to participate in a training with the focus around incorporating equity and just transition principles. So more to come on that. And that's it. Yeah, thank you. And thank you for taking the time.
Absolutely. Sorry to rush you.
That's okay.
Does anybody have questions right now on that?
I would have, good to see you in person, nice to recognize you after all these years of Hollywood Squares. So one thing, if you haven't yet, I would encourage the Just Transition Subcommittee to have kind of an intentional meeting with the long-term recovery groups, or at least a representative thereof, because I mean, those are absolutely frontline communities. So it'd just be good, I think, for that group to hear directly from the folks working with the people who've been most directly impacted. What's that?
Ben gave a thumbs up for that.
And the other one, this is an action item, but I think it absolutely gets to Just Transition. So folks, where I grew up in Southwest Virginia, they just got hammered along with Northwestern North Carolina, Northeast Tennessee by Helene, and of course other points south. We really need to think about, I think it's an action item, develop robust, trusted community recovery communication frameworks to dispel misinformation and disinformation, because there are a lot of people hurting who are not getting access and aid that they should because of armed assholes trying to prevent that. And it's not just that, you also just, it's the rumor spreading that FEMA is going to come confiscate your land so they can mine lithium on it. All this intentional bullshit, pardon my French, but I'm really fired up about it, that is causing real people from getting real help. And we can't say that won't happen in Vermont. And maybe Ben or others know if it did during our last year's flooding and this year's flooding. But he's shaking his head. But just, I mean, which is great, but just I mean, we're in a different world now.
There was one clown who thought that FEMA had sort of a black ops operation at the trail rest area on I-89 where they were staging the mobile home units. But other than that, which was squelched pretty well, I think we were spared a lot of that nonsense.
Yeah, it was, for so folks don't know, I got these rumors too, I was feeding them to FEMA that, yeah, people assume that where they were storing the trailers at the, right near the intersection with I-91 and 89, was that they were going to warehouse people there, that was gonna be just kind of like a detention camp for Vermonters or something, yeah.
There was a fence, so there was clearly a conspiracy.
Any other suggestions or comments right now on the rubric?
You know, my only thought is a lot of the questions about how does it affect each different type of community and things like that. I mean, every different project within you know, water, wastewater, fossil reduction, energy, all has more or less of that. So for instance, on the energy side, we're actually implementing new resiliency projects now, and we're just working with the homeowners, and it benefits everyone, and it's not all that intrusive, and they're happy to see us. That might not be the same, right? Depending on what you're doing. So just a thought there that it's not going to be the same for every resiliency thing that you're doing. And probably everyone knows that, but we don't want to slow down progress where it's happening either, right? So that's all. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Danielle, for going over that. That was a really good explanation. I like the way you walked through that. It's very helpful. So just quickly, because we just have a couple more minutes, things that I wrote down as follow-up, but happy to have others chime in. Marianne, you were going to follow up with an email with the PowerPoint, asking at least task leads about what they felt was important to include in those slides, and then solicit some input for who wants to present what. So we'll look for that email from you. I didn't have anything else specific coming out of this meeting. How do we want to handle, do we have enough input on questions for the stakeholder meetings, or how else do we want to sort of close that task?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because in the other groups, it was like, because it's been by task group, like kind of you had a small group, like working on that together. I know David had just asked for a shout out, and I think some of that was captured in the notes. I wonder, I mean, in terms of process, I would leave it up to you to decide what works best, but there's a couple options in terms of, you know, whether that's a shared document that's publicly available, whether you entrust a small group of people to get together and figure that out.
Yeah. That's sort of my preference, is to just have less than a quorum of people work on that. So if there's 2 or 3 people who are willing to work on that and feed that up to Sophie. Sophie, is that right?
Yeah, and keep you in the loop.
Yeah,
and,
yeah. I think that would be great. And really, I mean, it's just coming up with questions that we want to make sure are put out to the stakeholders and are answered. But
seems like we've got a good start based on the conversation.
Yeah.
I have a question about the events, because thinking about like what Danielle presented with, you know, we want to ultimately take the feedback from the folks we're hearing from and ensure that those are being incorporated into the recommendations. But our second feedback session is what, November 15th. When should we expect notes from those? And the other tricky part is, as Sophie just said, and we acknowledged, these aren't clearly aligned with our task groups. So how are we going to kind of divvy up? Like if we're getting a whole bunch of amazing feedback about businesses, but we haven't really articulated which task group is focusing on businesses, how do we, like, how are we going to do that in the time frame we have available to us?
I think, well, first is the question of what's the time frame for like sort of summary of, and who does the summary?
CDIs do.
Yeah, we'll handle that. I think for the buildings, for example, which happened yesterday, I think we'll probably get the notes on like Monday.
David just
okay. So I think the turnaround time is like a couple of days.
Yeah.
Not a huge amount of time. We can immediately get like, within the next day, get you like the chat, the recording, and the Menti poll results, so that we can get out really quickly, and then the notes just need like a couple of extra days.
Okay, well, so if I can throw it out, if there's any possibility, I know David's just left, so we can't get his feedback, but like if CBI could structure the feedback in a way that maybe aligns with the focus of our task groups,
They might be able
so
to.
that we don't have to like comb through it and somebody has to debate up on our own, that would be really great.
Yeah, there might be some way to kind of like make a template for the notes, so as Charlotte's note taking,
She can be like, okay, that seems relevant to infrastructure, this is around municipal
or maybe
capacity.
she does that the next day or
Yeah,
two.
but that would be, if that's something that CBI can do, that would be amazing.
I will ask them.
Thank you.
Yeah, cool.
Awesome. So for November, obviously, the stakeholder meetings are a big focus. The RPC meetings, thank you, Scott and Chris, for volunteering to be at those, and just encourage everybody else to participate if you can, and especially the stakeholder meetings, register and plan to attend if you can. And then, you know, it's getting towards the revised recommendations as quickly as possible. So definitely a pretty big lift in November. Want to remind everybody that David said he's available to help us. And I think, you know, that's a great offer. So if we're struggling, I think it's a really good idea to tap him on that. That would be great.
I think y'all have been working more with Catherine and Dimitri on this, but when is the guidance gonna be going out on the RP meetings, the RPCs are helping with?
Sorry, say that again?
The meetings the RPCs are helping with, when is guidance going out to us to help? Are we just showing up or are we
Yeah,
doing something?
so, Liz sent an email, I think it was only to co-chairs, about the ask for those sessions is pulling out the municipal related actions from your work and getting those back to us. And then we'll take care of like assembling all of those from the 3 different subcommittees.
So what-
You're talking about the meetings that the RPCs are doing.
Yeah, just what's the ask of us?
Like what's the after the RPCs?
Oh, the RPC, sorry, when you said us, I thought you meant the subcommittee.
Yeah, we need,
We being the RPCs?
yeah,
We're
sorry.
coordinating with Catherine Dimitrick.
right.
And so unless you hear anything directly from them, I don't think you need to worry about doing anything. I think they're gonna coordinate that directly with you. And by you, I don't know if I'm talking about you, Chris Campany, or.
I'm talking RPCs. I just want to make sure we have enough lead time to do if there's any, if it's beyond just showing up or what, anyway, we'll figure it out, but just clock is ticking.
Yeah, I think the main ask is gonna be getting the word out,
Okay, that's easy enough.
and that'll come through
Yeah,
Northwest RPC,
Yeah,
Northwest
okay.
Marlena.
yep, that's fine.
Yeah, and we are, okay, I got one more thing. Just with the revised recommendations, I really think, and I'll put it out there and everybody can be like, that's not gonna happen or whatever, but I really think it would be awesome if we could share our revised recommendations with the subcommittee in advance of our November meeting, so we can have a chance to look through those and digest them rather than have to do that on the fly during the meeting like we did today. So that's November 22nd, and we can aim for like the week before for sharing. And I know that's a lot and it doesn't give a lot of time to incorporate the second stakeholder meeting, but we're just gonna have to figure out how that can go. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention, of course, was the David's availability for the helping on the recommendations, revised recommendations, and the applying the rubric. So those are kind of just keep those things in mind as we're moving forward on the modifications and revisions. And thanks, there's a lot to do. Reach out if you have questions along the way. And I guess that's it for today. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
It's Friday.